Hello, fellow travelers of Middle-earth. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden secrets of Tolkien's world, please like this video and subscribe to join our fellowship of truth seekers. A pale moon hung above the ancient ruins of Weathertop, casting long shadows across weathered stone. The night air carried an unnatural chill, far colder than autumn should permit. At the summit of the once mighty watchtower of Amon Sul stood a figure robed in grey, his beard silvered by moonlight, his eyes fixed upon the eastern horizon. Gandalf the Grey waited, not in ambush, as the histories would later claim, not in surprise, as he would tell the hobbits. He waited with purpose, with knowledge, with dread certainty of what approached. "He comes," the wizard whispered to the night. From the east a darkness moved against the darkness, a shadow within shadow crowned with steel and malice. The Witch King of Angmar approached alone, his black robes undisturbed by the rising wind. No mount carried him this night, no lesser ringwraiths accompanied their lord. This meeting required privacy. "The hour is appointed," spoke a voice like stone grinding against metal, hollow yet terribly present. "You have brought it." Gandalf's hand tightened around his staff, but he made no move toward Glamdring at his side. "I have brought knowledge only," he answered, as we agreed. "Knowledge," the wraith hissed, the words stretching into the night. "Knowledge forbidden." "All knowledge is forbidden to someone," Gandalf countered. "Yet here we stand, servant of darkness and servant of light, both seeking the same truth." The Witch King moved closer, and frost formed upon the ancient stones beneath his feet. "Speak the words," he commanded. "Speak the binding oath that neither shall betray this meeting to our masters." Gandalf's eyes narrowed. "I serve no master." A sound emerged from the darkness beneath the Witch King's hood, a terrible approximation of laughter. "So you believe, Olorin?" The wizard stiffened at the use of his true name, one that no servant of the enemy should know. In that moment, beneath the cold stars above Weathertop, Gandalf began to understand the true depth of what he had stumbled upon. This was no simple enemy, no mere servant of Sauron. The Witch King carried knowledge that threatened the very foundations of the coming war. "I discovered the scroll in the Forgotten Archive," Gandalf said carefully. "The one written in blood upon human skin. It speaks of the void beyond the void, of the master whom even Sauron fears." The Witch King raised a gauntlet hand, "And I have brought the key to its translation. Together we shall read what was never meant to be read." "Why would you betray your lord in this?" Gandalf asked, though in his heart an impossible suspicion was taking root. The Witch King moved closer still, and when he spoke again his terrible voice had changed, carrying now an echo of something anciently human, something desperate. "Because Sauron believes he shall rule when the darkness comes. He is wrong. When the true master returns, all shall be consumed, both light and lesser darkness. Even you, Mithrandir, for all your wisdom, do not comprehend what awakens beyond the walls of night." From within his robes, the Witch King produced an object wrapped in cloth of midnight blue, embroidered with silver stars that seemed to glow with their own cold light. "This night changes everything," the wraith said. "After what we shall learn together, nothing in Middle-earth shall proceed as foreseen, not by elf wisdom, not by your white counsel, not by my dark master in Mordor." Gandalf felt fear then, true fear beyond any he had known in 2,000 years of walking the lands of Middle-earth. But with that fear came certainty. He must see what the Witch King had brought. The fate of all free peoples might depend upon this forbidden knowledge. "Then let us begin," Gandalf said, and stepped forward to seal a pact that history would never record, a secret that would alter the course of the War of the Ring before it had even begun. But what happened in the hours that followed would remain unspoken, hidden behind half-truths and deliberate omissions until now. For I have found the missing pieces scattered across forgotten scrolls and whispered rumors. I have uncovered the truth of what transpired between the great wizard and the Lord of the Nazgul upon Weathertop, and why both conspired to keep it secret from their allies and enemies alike. The forbidden truth shall now be revealed. Weathertop stood as a silent sentinel above the rolling hills of the ancient kingdom of Arna, its broken crown of stone, a remnant of glory long faded. Once called Amon Sul, the Hill of Wind, it had housed one of the greatest treasures of the northern kingdom, a seeing stone, a palantir of immense power. Though the watchtower now lay in ruins, the power lingering there could not be denied by those sensitive to such things. The Third Age had seen much blood spilled upon these stones. It was here that the last king of Arna made his final stand against the Witch King nearly 1,000 years past. It was here that the great kingdom fractured, leaving only memories and abandoned fortresses scattered across what would become the Lone Lands. And it was here, upon this hill of ancient significance, that powers beyond mortal understanding would converge on a chill autumn night. Gandalf the Grey had walked the paths of Middle-earth for over 2,000 years. Known by many names, Mithrandir to the elves, Tharkun to the dwarves, Incanus in the south, and Gandalf to the men of the north, he had ever been a wanderer. One of 5 Istari sent from across the western sea, his purpose had always been to guide and advise, never to dominate or command. Yet behind his humble appearance lay power that had not been fully unleashed since his arrival upon these shores. Few knew his true nature as a Maya, a spirit of the same order as Sauron himself, though lesser in stature than the great powers of Arda. Fewer still understood the constraints placed upon him by the Valar, the limitations that prevented him from wielding his full might against the darkness growing in the east. He was bound to counsel rather than command, to inspire rather than impose. This was his burden and his strength. The Witch King of Angmar, eldest and most terrible of the 9 ringwraiths, had once been a great king of men, perhaps the greatest of the 9 kings who had accepted the rings of power from Sauron's own hand. His name had been struck from all records, his history erased by time and deliberate action. Now he existed as a dreadful shadow of his former self, bound eternally to the will of the Dark Lord, or so all believed. What few scholars understood was that the Witch King retained knowledge from his mortal days, secrets of ancient sorcery practiced in realms now swallowed by the sea. He had been a student of forbidden arts long before Sauron presented him with his ring of power. These arts had drawn the Dark Lord's attention, made him an ideal vessel for Sauron's designs. Yet something of his original will remained, buried beneath layers of darkness and compulsion. The history commonly told speaks of confrontation upon Weathertop, a brief but terrible battle between the Grey Pilgrim and the Lord of the Nazgul. It tells of Gandalf, outnumbered by the 9, lighting a great fire upon the hilltop and escaping in the confusion. A tale of desperate resistance, nothing more. But certain texts in the hidden libraries of Minas Tirith tell a different story. Ancient weather records from the ranges of the north note an unusual phenomenon that night, a perfect circle of clouds above Weathertop, rotating slowly against the prevailing winds. The accounts of travelers who witnessed strange lights from afar describe not the chaotic flashes of battle, but steady, rhythmic pulses of brilliance, alternating between blinding white and deepest purple. Most telling was the testimony of birds. The great eagles reported to Gwaia, their windlord, that no creature could approach the hill that night, neither beast nor bird. An invisible boundary surrounded Weathertop, extending a league in all directions. Within this boundary, silence reigned absolute. Such a working required tremendous power. Yes, but more importantly, it required cooperation between the powers that established it. The timing, too, cannot be dismissed as coincidence. 5 days after this encounter, The waters of the Bruinen rose against the Nazgul, an event commonly attributed solely to Elrond's power. Yet ancient elven accounts mention Elrond's surprise at the river's unusual response exceeding what he had intended, as if some other influence had strengthened the water's rejection of the servants of Sauron. 3 days before the meeting, Gandalf had visited the ruins of Fornost, ancient capital of Arnor. No record explains his purpose there, but the rangers noted his unusual solemnity upon departing. He carried with him a small box of adderwood, a material known for its ability to contain magical energies. The box was not with him when he arrived at Rivendell after Weathertop. The Witch King, for his part, had detoured from the direct route to the Shire, spending precious hours in the Barrow Downs before resuming the hunt for the ring. The official records state he sought to awaken the Barrow Wights to aid in the search, yet no new wights arose during that time. Instead, something was removed from the central barrow, something that had lain untouched since the downfall of Cardolan. These scattered pieces of historical context do not form a complete picture, but they cast long shadows of doubt upon the accepted narrative. They suggest preparation rather than chance, collaboration rather than conflict. They hint at a convergence of powers drawn together by knowledge so dangerous that both light and darkness might temporarily find common cause. For there existed a third force in the equation, one neither Gandalf nor the Witch King served, a power older than Sauron, older perhaps than Arda itself, stirring once more beyond the walls of night. Its name appears in no history save one, a single manuscript locked in the deepest vault of Minas Tirith, written in a script so ancient that only 3 beings in Middle-earth could still decipher it. The manuscript speaks of the time before time, when darkness was not yet corrupt and light not yet formed. It speaks of an entity that was cast out before the music of the Ainur, whose discordant notes can still be heard by those with ears to listen. An entity that even Morgoth, first Dark Lord and master of Sauron, had feared. It was this manuscript that brought Gandalf to Weathertop that night, and it was knowledge of this entity that compelled the Witch King to meet him there, away from the watchful eye of his master in Mordor. For prophecy had long foretold that no man could kill the Lord of the Nazgul. What it did not reveal was the terrible reason why this protection had been granted, and the price that would one day come due. The official account of what transpired at Weathertop appears in the Red Book of Westmarch, drawn from Gandalf's own telling to Frodo and his companions at the Council of Elrond. According to this version, Gandalf was surrounded by the Nine upon the hilltop, fighting alone against overwhelming darkness. He described a desperate battle culminating in a brilliant flash of white flame before he escaped into the night. "I was on the hilltop at sunset," Gandalf reportedly said. "I was surrounded. In the dark I could not see, but I could feel their presence. I needed light, and so I made a flame. The hill was lit with a tremendous flash. They were upon me, and I was alone. I was hard put to it, but in the end I escaped." Words carefully chosen, each one technically truthful yet misleading in their arrangement. Gandalf indeed stood alone upon Weathertop at sunset. He indeed felt the presence of darkness approaching. He indeed created light. But the nature of that light and its purpose remained unspoken. Examination of the hilltop in the days following revealed peculiar evidence that contradicts the tale of chaotic battle. The rangers who ventured there found not the scattered marks of combat, but precise patterns burned into the stone. A perfect circle encompassed the summit, with intricate symbols etched at the 4 cardinal points. Within this circle lay another, and at its center, a symbol unknown to the rangers, complex and troubling to look upon. More curious still were the objects left behind. A broken dagger of Westernesse, its blade inscribed with spells against the forces of Angmar, yet deliberately snapped at the hilt. A silver pendant bearing the white tree of Gondor, partially melted as if exposed to tremendous heat. 5 black feathers arranged in a star pattern, a small vial of clear liquid that evaporated when exposed to sunlight, and strangest of all, a single perfect crystal that seemed to hold a star within its depths. None of these artifacts were mentioned in Gandalf's account. None appeared in any official record of the encounter. They were gathered by the Rangers and delivered to Rivendell, where they vanished from history. No mention of them appears in any elven record, suggesting a deliberate suppression of their existence. The few witnesses who observed Weathertop from afar that night tell a story at odds with the official narrative. A merchant traveling the East Road reported seeing not chaotic flashes of battle, but a sustained column of light rising from the hill into the heavens, lasting for hours. A shepherd tending his flock near the Weather Hills described strange music carried on the wind, neither elven nor human in origin, that filled him with both dread and inexplicable hope. Most compelling is the testimony of Radagast the Brown, who encountered Gandalf on the road 3 days after Weathertop. Though the brown wizard seldom involved himself in the great matters of Middle-earth, preferring the company of birds and beasts, his account survives in a letter sent to Saruman, later preserved in the archives of Isengard. "I found Mithrandir upon the Greenway," Radagast wrote. "He was changed. There was about him a gravity I had not seen before, as one who has looked upon something not meant for mortal eyes. When I asked of his journey, he spoke of Weathertop only briefly, claiming weariness from battle with the Nine. Yet no wound marked him, and the birds that accompany me everywhere would not approach him. They whispered of shadow and light mingled in ways unnatural. When I pressed him further, he asked if I still possessed the key to the Western cipher, that ancient code developed by Melian in the First Age. When I confirmed that I did, he grew silent and would speak no more of Weathertop." The Western cipher Radagast mentioned was a method of concealing messages within seemingly ordinary text, known only to the Astari and certain High Elves. It had been created specifically to hide information from the Servants of Darkness. That Gandalf inquired about it immediately after Weathertop suggests information of tremendous sensitivity had come into his possession. The Nazgul, for their part, behaved strangely in the aftermath of Weathertop. They did not immediately resume their hunt for the ring, but scattered briefly, each riding in a different direction, before regrouping days later. Rangers reported seeing the Witch King himself standing motionless upon a hill far to the east, as if listening to some distant call. When he rejoined his fellows, their pursuit of the ring-bearer took on a strange quality, alternating between relentless hunting and inexplicable delays. Perhaps most telling were the dreams that afflicted both elves and men in the nights following the encounter at Weathertop. In Rivendell, Elrond spoke of visions of a great eye, not wreathed in flame, as was Sauron's symbol, but an eye of perfect darkness rimmed with stars. In Bree the innkeeper, Barliman Butterbur found himself dreaming of a tower taller than the sky, its foundations deeper than the roots of mountains, and in his cell in Gondor, the mad prophet Malbeth awakened screaming of the void that hungers and the darkness between the stars. Such dreams might be dismissed as coincidence, were it not for one crucial detail. Each dreamer reported awakening with the same phrase upon their lips, a phrase in a language none of them knew or could later recall. Only when the words were written down and compared did the pattern emerge. Each had spoken the same 8 words in the ancient tongue of Númenor, a phrase that translates roughly to, "When the bounded is unbound, both light and shadow end." These documented facts, scattered across various accounts and deliberately obscured from direct connection, form a constellation pointing toward a truth more complex than a simple battle between good and evil. They suggest a meeting with purpose, an exchange of critical information, and measures taken by both parties to conceal the true nature of their interaction. But to understand why a servant of light and a servant of darkness would risk such a meeting, we must look deeper into the ancient prophecies that bound both Gandalf and the Witch King to their respective paths, and the looming threat that may have temporarily aligned their interests against a common doom. The stones of Weathertop hold memories beyond those recorded in any book. In the months following the encounter, rangers patrolling the area discovered strange markings appearing on the ancient ruins, symbols that seemed to emerge from within the stone itself rather than being carved upon it. These markings corresponded to no known language of elf, man, or dwarf, yet they possessed a terrible symmetry that suggested deliberate communication. A ranger captain named Halbered, kinsman to Aragorn, made careful copies of these symbols before they faded with the first winter frost. He delivered these copies to Rivendell, noting in his journal that the very act of tracing these marks filled me with unease, as though I transcribed words never meant for mortal understanding. The copies disappeared into Elrond's private study and were never seen again. Yet one symbol among those copied found its way elsewhere, a perfect circle bisected by a vertical line, with 3 stars positioned above. This exact mark appeared months later in Gandalf's own handwriting, scratched hastily in the margin of a letter to Círdan at the Grey Havens. When questioned about it by the shipwright, Gandalf claimed it was merely an absent-minded doodle. Círdan, who had known Gandalf since his arrival in Middle-earth, 2,000 years before, noted that in all that time he had never once seen the wizard doodle. More telling was the 5-day absence of Gandalf following Weathertop. The official account states he traveled directly to Rivendell after escaping the Nazgûl, yet records in Bree confirm he did not pass that way until 5 days after the night at Weathertop, despite the journey requiring only 3 days on foot. Where was Gandalf during those missing days? No record exists to answer this question, but a curious report from woodsmen near the Trollshaws tells of strange lights moving beneath the earth, visible through cracks in the stone of a hillside where 3 trolls had once been turned to stone. This same hillside contained ancient caves that predated even the elves' awakening in Middle-earth. Caves that Gandalf had once explored with Thorin's company on their journey to Erebor. Caves said to contain writings from the earliest days of Arda, when the Valar themselves walked the new-formed earth. The Witch King's movements during this same period reveal their own inconsistencies. According to the accounts Frodo received, all 9 ringwraiths pursued him from Weathertop to the ford of Bruinen, yet multiple reliable witnesses in the Lone Lands reported seeing only 8 black riders moving east. The Witch King himself seemed to have temporarily separated from his fellows. A merchant traveling the East Road swore that he encountered a tall figure in black, standing alone by the roadside near dawn, 5 days after the night at Weathertop. The figure asked him a single question: "Does the light still shine upon the western shore?" When the merchant, puzzled, replied that he supposed it did, the figure seemed to relax, saying only, "Then there is still time," before vanishing into the morning mist. This question, innocuous to the merchant's ears, carried profound significance to any versed in the ancient lore of Númenor. The light upon the western shore referred to Avalone, the easternmost city of Tol Eressëa, whose tower bore a great light visible from the coast of Númenor before its downfall. That light symbolized the connection between mortal realms and the Undying Lands, a connection severed with Númenor's destruction. For the Witch King, once a lord of Númenor before accepting Sauron's ring, to inquire about this light suggested a momentary reconnection with his mortal origins, a brief resurfacing of the man he had been before darkness consumed him. Perhaps most disturbing among the clues was the discovery made in Rivendell's library after Gandalf's departure with the Fellowship. A book of ancient prophecies, dating from the early Second Age, was found open upon a reading table, certain passages underlined in red ink. The book itself was unremarkable, containing mostly well-known predictions about the tides of darkness and light in Middle-earth. But the underlined passages, when read together, formed a narrative previously overlooked. They spoke of a time when the servant shall remember he was once a master, and the counselor shall become a commander. They mentioned the joining of flame and shadow against the hunger beyond, and warned that when the 9 become 8 and the 5 become 4, the 3rd shall awaken. These cryptic lines gained terrible significance when viewed alongside another clue: Gandalf's staff. The wizards of Middle-earth carried staves as symbols of their authority and focuses for their power. Gandalf's staff had for centuries been a gnarled length of hardwood, unadorned save for a slight crystal setting near its top. But observers at the Council of Elrond noted a change. The staff now bore faint inscriptions along its length, writing so small and fine that it could not be read without close inspection. No one thought to make such an inspection until after Gandalf's fall in Moria. Then, when his possessions were gathered and prepared to be held in his memory, Aragorn noticed the tiny script. It spiraled around the staff in an unbroken line, written in a variant of Quenya so ancient that even Elrond struggled to translate portions of it. What they could decipher spoke of boundaries between worlds, of the nature of the void, and of bindings placed upon powers in the earliest days of creation. The final section contained a warning. Should the Nameless return, all oaths are unmade. This phrase matched exactly one found in the private papers of the Witch King, discovered centuries earlier in the ruins of Khand Dûm by an expedition from Gondor and locked away in the deepest vaults of Minas Tirith. These scattered clues formed a constellation pointing toward a disturbing possibility that both Gandalf and the Witch King had become aware of some third force, some threat greater than the conflict between Sauron and the free peoples of Middle-earth. A threat that may have caused these ancient enemies to briefly set aside their enmity to address a common danger. But what could possibly represent a threat greater than Sauron himself? The answer lay partially in the most overlooked detail of all, hidden in plain sight within the very name Gandalf used for his greatest foe. In all his long years in Middle-earth, Gandalf rarely spoke the name Sauron aloud. Instead, he referred to the Dark Lord as the enemy or the Nameless One. Yet Sauron was not nameless. His name was known, recorded in countless texts, and spoken fearfully throughout the land. So who, then, was the truly Nameless One, to whom Gandalf referred in his private writings? Who was the enemy that even the enemy feared? The answer to this question would begin to emerge during the secret conversation atop Weathertop, a conversation that would shake the foundations of everything both Gandalf and the Witch King believed about their place in the cosmic order of Middle-earth. The wind fell silent over Weathertop as Gandalf and the Witch King faced one another in the growing darkness. No record exists of their exact words, yet through fragments of evidence, ancient texts, and the subsequent actions of both beings, we can reconstruct the substance of their exchange, a dialogue never meant for other ears. "You came alone," Gandalf observed, his voice steady despite standing before the most terrible servant of the enemy. The Witch King's response came as a whisper that seemed to emerge from the air itself rather than from beneath his dark hood. "As did you, Olorin. No White Council observes us. No lesser wraiths attend me." "You know that name," Gandalf said, surprise briefly overcoming his caution. "How would a servant of Sauron know my true name?" A sound like distant thunder emanated from the Witch King, perhaps laughter. "I knew your name before Sauron claimed me. Before this shadow was forced upon me. I was once among the learned of Númenor, keeper of the Star Law. I read of the Mire in texts brought from the Undying Lands." Gandalf's grip tightened on his staff. "What remains of that lore master now? Nothing but a wraith bound to darkness. Is that what you believe?" The Witch King moved forward, frost crystallizing on the stone beneath his feet. "That I am merely Sauron's puppet, I, who was studying the music of creation, while your precious hobbits were still learning to farm the earth." "Then why serve him?" "The same reason you serve your hidden masters in the West, because we are bound. Because we have no choice." The wraith extended a gauntlet hand, black metal gleaming dully in the fading light. "But bonds can be broken, Ori, especially when something comes that was never accounted for in the music." Gandalf remained still, neither retreating nor advancing. "Speak plainly. What have you discovered that warranted this meeting? Not discovered, remembered. The Witch King's voice dropped lower still. In the dungeons beneath Minas Morgul, I found a chamber sealed since before the foundation of Barad-dûr. Within it lay a palantir, unlike the 7 made for the men of Númenor. This stone was older, darker, its visions not of distant places, but of distant times. A dangerous artifact, Gandalf said carefully. Such things are often trapped. Indeed, the trap was sprung long ago when Sauron himself attempted to master it. He failed. The stone shattered his concentration, forced him to see what he had forgotten in his lust for dominion. The Wraith paused. He saw what comes after his victory should he achieve it. He saw what waits beyond the walls of night, growing stronger with each passing age. Gandalf's expression hardened. The Nameless. So you do know. The Witch King's shoulders straightened, as if a great suspicion had been confirmed. The true enemy, older than Morgoth, older than Arda itself, the void that hungers. I have suspected, Gandalf admitted reluctantly. There are passages in the oldest texts that speak of a discord before the music began, a note that was silenced but not destroyed. I believed them metaphorical. They are not. The Nameless was cast out before the creation of Ea, but not unmade. It cannot be unmade, for it is the shadow of Ilúvatar himself, the doubt before certainty, the void before creation. And now it stirs again, reaching through the thinning places between worlds. Gandalf was silent for a long moment, weighing the Wraith's words against centuries of his own research and suspicion. Finally he asked, "Why tell me this? What does Sauron's most faithful servant gain by revealing such knowledge?" The Witch King's response came with unexpected heat. "Faithful, I, who have died 1,000 deaths in his service. I, who remember what it was to be a king of men, a scholar, a father. I serve because this cursed ring binds me to his will, not out of loyalty." He continued, voice lowering to a hiss. "Sauron believes the Nameless will elevate him when it returns, make him a god in truth, rather than merely in his own mind. He is a fool. The Nameless devours all light and darkness alike. I have seen this truth in the shattered Palantir. I have heard the Void speaking my true name, offering freedom if I would only help it enter our world. And now you fear this entity," Gandalf concluded. "Fear." The Witch King's laugh was like ice cracking. "I have lived in fear for 3,000 years, wizard. This is not fear, this is clarity. When the Nameless comes, even death will provide no escape for me. My spirit, bound by the ring, will not pass beyond the circles of the world but be consumed, experiencing an eternity of unmaking." Gandalf's eyes narrowed. "So this is about saving yourself." "It is about saving everything," the Witch King countered. "Even your precious light cannot withstand what comes. The prophecy of my fall, that no man can kill me. It was never protection. It was a prison sentence, ensuring I would remain to witness the end." The wizard considered this. "What do you propose, then?" "I cannot free you from Sauron's service. The ring binds you until its destruction." "Not freedom, knowledge." The Witch King reached within his robes and withdrew an object wrapped in cloth. "I bring you the key to the Western cipher, the code hidden within the Book of Stars. With it, you can read what the last scholars of Númenor discovered about the Nameless and the 7 gates that keep it at bay. And in exchange, you will bring me the words of unmaking, the spell recorded in the hidden chamber beneath Orthanc. Saruman believes it a weapon against Sauron. He is wrong. It is a binding meant for something far older." Gandalf's brow furrowed. "How do you know of this?" "Because I helped write it. In my mortal life, my knowledge, combined with elven magic, created a seal that would hold back the Nameless for another age. But the words alone are not enough. They must be spoken by voices from both light and shadow, at the moment when the stars align as they did at the creation of Arda. A dangerous collaboration, Gandalf said quietly. More dangerous is doing nothing, the Witch King replied. Already the signs manifest, dreams of an eye rimmed with stars, cold fire that burns without consuming. Animals fleeing from forests where no predator hunts, the dead stirring not at Sauron's command but from some deeper calling. Gandalf fell silent, weighing the words against his suspicions. Finally, he spoke. I will not take what you offer yet. First, prove your words have substance. Tell me something about the nameless that I cannot possibly know, something that I can verify independently. The Witch King nodded slowly. It has many names in many tongues, but all mean the same thing, the hunger between stars. In the deepest chambers of Khazad-dûm, the dwarves carved warnings of it in stone, though they knew not what they warned against. They wrote, deeper than deeps, where no light has shone. That which unmakes waits to unmake all. Look there if you dare, but do not delve too greedily, as Durin's folk did. What they awakened was not merely a Balrog. With these words, the true substance of their meeting began to take shape. For the next several hours, beneath a sky wheeling with silent stars, a servant of light and a servant of darkness exchanged forbidden knowledge, each seeking to verify the other's claims, each reluctantly coming to accept the terrible truth. They both served causes that were merely pieces in a larger game, one that had been playing out since before the beginning of time itself. By dawn, they had reached an accord, though not one either would have willingly chosen. The Witch King departed eastward, carrying with him certain knowledge that would alter his pursuit of the ring. Gandalf remained on Weathertop until sunset, deep in troubled thought, before setting out on his 5-day journey to the hidden caves beneath the Troll Shores. Neither spoke of their meeting afterward, save in the most cryptic terms. Neither fully trusted the other, yet both understood that the fate of all things, from the greatest of the Valar to the smallest creatures of Middle-earth, might depend upon their reluctant cooperation against an enemy that threatened to unmake the very foundations of reality itself. Beneath the surface of the War of the Ring lay currents far deeper and more ancient than the struggle between Sauron and the free peoples of Middle-earth. The White Council, formed to counter the growing shadow in the east, operated with a hidden directive known only to its oldest members, one not shared even with Saruman, its leader. This directive, established by Galadriel and Círdan at the Council's founding, concerned not Sauron, but what might follow should he be defeated. For the wisest of the Eldar remembered the pattern of darkness in Middle-earth. Each Dark Lord had been but a lieutenant of the one before, each rising greater than the last. Morgoth had been the master of Sauron, but who had been the master of Morgoth? This question haunted the margins of the oldest texts, hinted at but never directly addressed. Gandalf knew of this directive, carried it as his primary mission, though he spoke of it to no one. His constant wandering, often dismissed by others as aimless, followed a careful pattern established over centuries. He visited ancient sites of power, places where the boundaries between worlds had grown thin. He collected lore, not just about Sauron, but about the foundations of Arda itself, about the nature of the void from which all things had been made. The Witch King, bound to Sauron's will through the ring he had accepted, nevertheless maintained certain freedoms within the constraints of his servitude. Chief among these was the pursuit of knowledge. As Sauron's most trusted lieutenant, he had access to dark lore gathered over thousands of years, texts and artifacts stolen from fallen kingdoms, secrets gleaned from the torture of immortal beings. Within this forbidden library, hidden in the deepest chambers of Minas Morgul, the Witch King discovered references to an entity that even Sauron mentioned only in tones of unease. The Black Speech had no name for this being, referring to it only as the hunger from beyond. In the ancient scrolls of Númenor, It was called the Unmaker. The elves of the First Age had named it Morkana, the Dark Maker, and established rites specifically to ward against its influence. Most disturbing to the Witch King was the realization that the rings of power, including the 9 given to mortal kings, contained elements of this entity's essence. Sauron had not created the rings alone. He had drawn upon older, deeper magics, tapping into the void itself to enhance their potency. The price of this power was a thinning of the barriers that kept the Nameless One at bay. Every use of the rings, from Sauron's domination of his servants to Galadriel's preservation of Lothlorien, inadvertently strengthened the Nameless One's connection to Middle-earth. The more the rings were used, the closer the ancient enemy came to breaking through the walls of night. This terrible knowledge explained much about the Witch King's seemingly contradictory actions. His reluctance to seize the ring from Frodo at Weathertop, often attributed to caution or fear of Aragorn, stemmed from a deeper calculation. If Sauron regained the One Ring and achieved total domination of Middle-earth, the final barrier holding back the Nameless One would fall. Victory for his master meant doom for all, including the Ringwraiths themselves. Gandalf, for his part, carried a burden few in Middle-earth could comprehend. As a Maya, a spirit who had existed before the creation of the world, he possessed fragmentary memories of the void and what dwelled there. These memories had been dampened when he assumed bodily form in Middle-earth, part of the limitations placed upon the Istari by the Valar. But in dreams and moments of deep meditation, echoes of that ancient knowledge resurfaced. He knew that the Valar themselves feared what lay beyond the walls of night. He suspected that his mission in Middle-earth, ostensibly to help the Free Peoples resist Sauron, served a secondary purpose to strengthen the fabric of reality itself against incursion from outside. This explained why the Istari had been forbidden from matching power against power with Sauron. Such conflicts thinned the barriers between worlds, creating opportunities for greater darkness to enter. The revelation that the Witch King possessed similar knowledge, arrived at through entirely different means, represented both danger and opportunity for Gandalf. Danger, because such knowledge in the hands of a servant of darkness could be catastrophically misused. Opportunity, because the Witch King's very nature as a wraith made him sensitive to disturbances in the fabric between worlds. He could perceive what even Gandalf might miss. Their meeting at Weathertop thus established a tacit agreement, never formalized, but understood by both. They would maintain their respective roles in the War of the Ring, Gandalf guiding the Free Peoples toward resistance, the Witch King commanding Sauron's forces in pursuit of the Ring. But beneath these actions, both would work to monitor and strengthen the barriers against the greater threat. This explained Gandalf's 5-day absence after Weathertop. He had traveled to an ancient site in the Troll Shores, a place where the veil between worlds was particularly thin, to establish new wards using knowledge gained from the Witch King. It explained why the Nazgul, after nearly capturing Frodo on Weathertop, subsequently allowed him to reach the ford of Bruinen when they could have easily overtaken him on the road. Most significantly, it explained a curious amendment to the prophecy regarding the Witch King's fate. The commonly known version stated that not by the hand of man shall he fall, but the complete text, found only in the private libraries of Elrond and Galadriel, continued, "Yet fall he must, when darkness calls to darkness, and the greater shadow stretches forth its hand." This prophecy took on new meaning in light of the secret pact. The Witch King's inevitable defeat was not merely fated but necessary, a sacrifice that would temporarily strengthen the barriers against the Nameless One. His passing from the circles of the world would release energy bound up in his ring, energy that could be redirected to reinforce the walls of night. The Witch King knew this. His question to the merchant on the East Road, about the light on the western shore, was not mere nostalgia for his mortal days, but a coded inquiry about the state of the barriers between Middle-earth and the Undying Lands. for it was from those lands that the strongest wards against the Nameless One emanated. Gandalf's response to this information shaped his subsequent actions in ways subtle but profound. His insistence that Frodo take the ring to Mount Doom rather than hiding or using it came not merely from fear of Sauron regaining his power, but from understanding that the ring's destruction would release its bound energy in a way that could be channeled against the greater threat. His willingness to face the Balrog in Moria, a confrontation he had avoided for centuries, stemmed from recognition that this servant of Morgoth might possess knowledge about the nature of the Nameless One. His instruction to Aragorn, before falling into shadow to look to the east, carried a double meaning. Watch for Sauron's movements, yes, but also for signs of disturbance in the fabric of reality itself. The White Council never learned of Gandalf's secret communication with the Witch King. Galadriel may have suspected her mirror showed many things, and her questions to Frodo about voices in the darkness hinted at deeper concerns than merely Sauron's return. Elrond, keeper of lore stretching back to the First Age, maintained records of the Nameless One in his private archives, texts he showed to neither his counselors nor the members of the Fellowship. As for the Witch King, his private agenda remained equally concealed from his master. Sauron, focused entirely on regaining the One Ring and subjugating Middle-earth, dismissed the ancient prophecies of the Nameless One as irrelevant to his ambitions. The Dark Lord's pride would not allow him to consider that he might be merely a pawn in a larger game, that his very existence served the designs of a power greater and more terrible than himself. This deeper agenda, hidden beneath the visible conflict of the War of the Ring, explained many of the seemingly inexplicable decisions made by both Gandalf and the Witch King. It cast their roles not as simple agents of light and darkness, but as reluctant collaborators against a threat that transcended such distinctions, and it raised a disturbing possibility that the entire history of Middle-earth, from the creation of the rings to the final battle before the Black Gate, had unfolded according to a design neither the wise nor the mighty had fully comprehended. Perhaps most revealing was what transpired in the immediate aftermath of the Weathertop meeting. The rangers patrolling the area reported unusual phenomena throughout the region. Flocks of birds flew in perfect circles for hours. The stars themselves seemed to flicker in patterns that caused even the most hardened warriors to avert their eyes. And most tellingly, for 3 consecutive nights, no living creature within 20 leagues of Weathertop dreamed. It was as if the very fabric of consciousness had been temporarily altered, a local ripple in the great tapestry of being. These effects could only be the result of powerful magic worked by both Gandalf and the Witch King together, combining light and shadow in ways neither was meant to be combined. Such cooperation between sworn enemies would have been unthinkable without the presence of a threat so great that it transcended their ancient enmity. The deeper agenda thus revealed was nothing less than the preservation of existence itself, a cause that united the wisest of the wise and the darkest of the dark in common purpose, even as they continued their visible conflict. For in this greatest of games, they had discovered a terrible truth. They were not the players but the pieces, not the composers but notes in a greater symphony whose conclusion might be either transcendent harmony or absolute silence. In the hidden archives of Imladris maintained by Elrond since the founding of that haven lay a scroll written on material neither parchment nor paper, but a substance unknown in Middle-earth. Brought from Númenor before its drowning, the scroll contained writing in a script that predated even the Fëanorian letters used by the High Elves. This document, known to only a handful of the eldest beings in Middle-earth, contained what scholars called the prophecy of the Nameless. Unlike most prophecies, which revealed potential futures or declared certain events inevitable, this ancient text described something that had already occurred, yet also lay in the future. It spoke of the creation of Arda, not as a finished act, but as an ongoing process, one that could be undone if certain conditions were met. It named the Nameless One not as an adversary of the Valar, but as their shadow, the possibility of uncreation that gave meaning to the act of creation itself. Most crucially, the prophecy outlined 7 signs that would herald the Nameless One's attempt to enter Arda completely, to move from influence to presence, from suggestion to domination. These signs were recorded in language so cryptic that even Elrond, with all his lore, had deciphered only 4 with certainty. The first sign, the servant crowned with fire, shall seek dominion over all lands. This clearly referred to Sauron, the Maiar who had become a Dark Lord in his own right. The second sign, 9 shall become 8, yet gain in power. The reduction of the Nazgul by 1, yet a strengthening of their collective influence. The third sign, the dead shall walk unaided by any master's call, not the Barrow Wights or the army of the dead bound by ancient oaths, a truly independent movement of those who had passed beyond the circles of the world. The fourth sign, the light in the west shall falter, the dimming of the power of the Eldar, as they departed Middle-earth for the undying lands. These 4 signs had manifested in the Third Age, documented by the White Council and discussed in their private deliberations, but the remaining 3 signs remained unclear, their translations disputed among the wise. It was these final signs that prompted Gandalf's interest in the Witch King, for as a being who existed simultaneously in the physical and spiritual realms, the Lord of the Nazgul might perceive aspects of reality hidden even from the Istari. The meeting at Weathertop had confirmed Gandalf's worst fears. The Witch King revealed his knowledge of the 5th sign. The Ring of Destiny shall hang between fire and darkness, its chosen bearer neither wholly alive nor dead. This perfectly described Frodo carrying the One Ring toward Mordor, his spirit increasingly caught between the physical world and the Wraith realm. The 6th sign, which the Witch King had observed manifesting in the deeps beneath Minas Morgul, the foundations of stone shall dream of what existed before stone. Mountains throughout Middle-earth had begun to resonate with strange harmonics, imperceptible to most but felt by creatures like stone giants and trolls, driving them to unusual behavior. The 7th and final sign remained untranslated, the symbols on the ancient scroll too degraded to interpret with confidence. But the Witch King possessed a fragment of knowledge passed down from his days as a sorcerer king of men before the ring claimed him. This fragment suggested the final sign involved the unmaking of that which cannot be unmade and the shattering of the unbreakable bond. Most scholars would have interpreted these phrases metaphorically. The Witch King understood them literally, for he had experienced the unmaking of his own mortality, the shattering of his bond to the natural cycle of life and death. He feared the 7th sign referred to the breaking of the music of the Ainur itself, the fundamental harmony that defined existence within Arda. This interpretation cast new light on the famous prophecy regarding the Witch King's own fate, that not by the hand of man shall he fall. This was not mere foretelling of how he would meet his end, but a critical piece of the larger prophecy of the Nameless One, for the Witch King's destruction had to occur in a very specific manner to avoid fulfilling the 7th sign. Were he to fall by the hand of a man, his unmaking would resonate with the Nameless One's own nature, creating a connection through which that ancient entity could exert greater influence. Were he to be destroyed by elven or dwarven hand, other consequences equally dire might unfold. The prophecy did not declare his invulnerability as a gift, but defined the narrow conditions of his end as a necessity. This explained the Witch King's seemingly contradictory behavior throughout the War of the Ring. His caution was not cowardice but calculation. He avoided direct confrontation with certain adversaries not out of fear for his own continuation, but from understanding that his end must come in a particular way and at a particular time. He served Sauron faithfully in most matters, while subtly working to ensure that when his inevitable fall came, it would occur in a manner that strengthened rather than weakened the barriers against the Nameless One. Gandalf, upon learning this aspect of the prophecy, faced a terrible quandary. His mission to oppose Sauron required the defeat of the Witch King, yet ensuring this defeat occurred in the prophesied manner necessitated a degree of cooperation with his enemy. He could not simply destroy the Lord of the Nazgul himself, nor could he allow just anyone to do so. The prophecy required a specific fulfillment, one that would turn the Witch King's end into a reinforcement of the walls between worlds rather than a breach. This knowledge transformed their meeting on Weathertop from a simple exchange of information into something far more profound, a deliberate setting in motion of events that would lead to the Witch King's prophesied fall at the hands of one who was not a man. They did not explicitly discuss who that would be, for such direct manipulation of fate might itself fulfill the seventh sign. Instead, they established the conditions that would allow the prophecy to unfold naturally, through the free choices of those involved. The full text of the prophecy regarding the Witch King, known only to the eldest beings in Middle-earth, contained verses never shared with the Council of Elrond, or recorded in any book accessible to mortal scholars. Not by the hand of man shall he fall, nor by the hand of elf or dwarf or tree, by the hand of that which was and was not, by the hand of that which is and is not. When shadow meets shadow at the breaking of the storm, when the eye turns inward and the hand turns outward, when the nameless is named and the named is forgotten, then shall the binding hold for an age and an age, until the unmaking of the world or its remaking. This cryptic verse pointed toward a specific fulfillment, one that both Gandalf and the Witch King recognized must involve someone who existed in a state of paradox, who was both one thing and another simultaneously. The verse offered hope that such a defeat, properly orchestrated, would strengthen the bindings holding the Nameless One at bay for an age and an age. It was this hope that united them in their secret pact. The true significance of the prophecy extended beyond the Witch King's own fate. It connected to a larger pattern woven throughout the history of Middle-earth, a pattern in which apparent defeats served higher purposes, and seemingly random chances revealed themselves as threads in a greater design. Gandalf had glimpsed this pattern during his communion with the higher powers, following his battle with the Balrog. The Witch King had perceived it through the distorted lens of his centuries as a wraith, seeing connections across time that were hidden from mortal perception. Together they recognized that the War of the Ring was but the visible manifestation of a much older conflict, one that had begun before the creation of Arda and would continue long after Sauron's defeat. The prophecy suggested that this conflict might ultimately be resolved not through the absolute victory of light over darkness, as the White Council believed, nor through the dominion of shadow over light, as Sauron intended, but through a more complex resolution involving the integration of opposing forces against a common threat. This understanding explained Gandalf's cryptic statement to Frodo that even the very wise cannot see all ends. The wizard was not merely expressing humility about the limits of foresight, but acknowledging the existence of a pattern so vast and intricate that even the Valar themselves could not fully comprehend it. A pattern in which the secret meeting between Gandalf and the Witch King at Weathertop was not a chance encounter, but a necessary convergence, a note that had to be played for the great symphony to continue toward its ultimate resolution. The most troubling aspect of the prophecy was what it suggested about the nature of evil itself in Middle-earth. If the Nameless One was indeed the shadow of Ilúvatar, the void that gave meaning to creation by representing what it was not, then the struggle between good and evil took on cosmic significance beyond mere moral conflict. It suggested that some measure of darkness was necessary for light to exist at all, that the complete eradication of evil might itself be the ultimate evil, creating the very conditions for the Nameless One to enter completely and unmake all things. This paradox haunted Gandalf's thoughts in the days following Weathertop. It explained his reluctance to use the full measure of his power, even in dire circumstances, his insistence on working through inspiration rather than domination. It revealed why he often chose to guide rather than command, to suggest rather than impose. For in the delicate balance between light and shadow lay the continued existence of Middle-earth itself, a balance that could be maintained only through the free choices of its inhabitants, not through the overwhelming power of either good or evil. The Witch King, ancient sorcerer that he was, understood this balance from the opposite perspective. He had witnessed firsthand the consequences of Sauron's desire for absolute domination, the way it thinned the barriers between worlds and invited influence from beyond. He had felt the subtle pull of the Nameless One growing stronger with each expansion of Sauron's power, each use of the rings to bend the natural order to unnatural will. Neither Gandalf nor the Witch King spoke these deepest insights aloud during their meeting at Weathertop. Such knowledge was too dangerous to articulate directly, too easily misunderstood or misused. Instead, they communicated through allusion and implication, through shared references to ancient texts and symbolic gestures drawn from traditions older than Middle-earth itself. In this cryptic exchange, they established not friendship, for that could never exist between them, but a mutual recognition of their roles in a cosmic drama whose ultimate resolution lay beyond the Third Age and perhaps beyond the comprehension of any being bound within the circles of the world. The prophecy of the Nameless One thus served as both warning and guide, a glimpse of what might be and what must not be, a reminder that even in the darkest times patterns of meaning persisted beneath the surface of events. It was this prophecy that brought Gandalf and the Witch King together at Weathertop, and it was this prophecy that would continue to shape their actions throughout the War of the Ring, visible to those with eyes to see but hidden from those who perceived only the surface conflict between light and shadow. The concept of alliance between Gandalf and the Witch King seemed impossible, an abomination against the natural order. One represented the highest wisdom of the West, a servant of the Valar sent to guide and protect. The other embodied the darkest corruption of the East, a once noble king transformed into an undying wraith bound to evil's service. Yet on that fateful night at Weathertop, something unprecedented occurred. Not a true alliance, perhaps, but a temporary alignment of purposes that would alter the course of the War of the Ring in ways few could imagine. This alignment centered on three specific agreements, never formalized but understood implicitly by both parties. First, they would continue their visible opposition while secretly coordinating their knowledge of the Nameless One's influence. Second, they would work separately to strengthen the barriers between worlds at key locations throughout Middle-earth. Third, they would ensure that when their final confrontation came, it would unfold in a manner that turned defeat into victory against the greater threat. The first evidence of this unexpected cooperation appeared in the aftermath of Frodo's wounding on Weathertop. According to all accounts, the Hobbit should have succumbed to the Morgul Blade's influence within days, becoming a wraith under the Witch King's control. Even Elrond, with all his healing skill, marveled at Frodo's extraordinary resilience. What remained unrecorded was the nature of the blade itself. The Witch King had subtly altered the enchantment upon the weapon before using it. While still terrible and potentially fatal, it had been crafted to work more slowly than standard Morgul blades, allowing sufficient time for the Hobbit to reach Rivendell. This modification represented an enormous risk for the Witch King. Had Sauron discovered this tampering, the punishment would have been unimaginable. Why take such a risk? Because the Witch King had recognized something crucial. Frodo Baggins possessed a unique quality essential to the prophecy's fulfillment. The Hobbit existed simultaneously in two realms after his wounding, part of his spirit drawn into the shadow world, while his body remained in the physical. This dual nature made him an ideal vessel for certain protective enchantments that required a bridge between worlds. The second indication came during the Fellowship's journey through Moria. The ancient dwarf city had been one of the thin places in Middle-earth, a location where the barriers between worlds had worn particularly thin due to the dwarves' deep delving and the awakening of the Balrog. Gandalf's confrontation with this ancient demon served multiple purposes beyond merely allowing the Fellowship to escape. The wizard's declaration, "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor," was not merely a statement of allegiance, but an activation of wards established long ago. The secret fire referred not only to the creative power of Ilúvatar, but to specific enchantments laid down at the foundation of Arda to protect against the Nameless One. By invoking this power in the depths of Moria, Gandalf strengthened the barriers at a critical weak point. What few knew was that simultaneously, in the depths of Minas Morgul, the Witch King conducted his own ritual of reinforcement. Witnesses among the orcs, later interrogated by rangers, spoke of the Lord of the Nazgûl standing alone in the lowest chamber of the tower for 3 days and nights, unmoving, surrounded by a circle of black candles that burned with cold fire. No sound emerged from this chamber, but the foundations of the tower trembled continuously, and none dared approach. This simultaneous working of power by beings aligned with light and darkness created a unique resonance, a harmonizing of opposing forces that strengthened the fabric of reality itself. Such cooperation between sworn enemies was unprecedented in the history of Middle-earth, a desperate measure justified only by awareness of a threat greater than their ancient enmity. The third and perhaps most remarkable evidence of their cooperation concerned the Palantiri, the seeing stones created in Númenor and brought to Middle-earth before that island's downfall. These powerful artifacts allowed communication across vast distances, but more importantly, they existed partially outside normal space and time. Each stone connected to all others, regardless of physical distance, creating a network that spanned Middle-earth. What was not widely known was that the Palantiri also served as anchors for the barriers between worlds. Their creation had involved arts brought from Valinor itself, techniques that allowed the stabilization of the boundaries between the physical realm and other dimensions. The loss and corruption of several stones had weakened these barriers significantly. Gandalf had long avoided using the Palantiri, aware of their dangers and Sauron's influence over them. The Witch King, however, had secret access to the stone kept in Minas Morgul, taken when that tower was still Minas Ithil of Gondor. After Weathertop, he began using this stone not to communicate with Sauron, but to strengthen the barriers it anchored, working subtle enchantments during moments when the Dark Lord's attention was directed elsewhere. This explains Gandalf's seemingly contradictory advice regarding the Palantir recovered from Orthanc to Aragorn. He cautioned great care, but did not forbid its use. In private, he gave more specific instructions, certain times when the stone should be used, particular thoughts that should be focused upon while gazing into its depths. These were not merely tactics for confronting Sauron, but techniques for reinforcing the stone's function as a barrier against the Nameless One. Perhaps most telling was the subtle coordination of movements throughout the War of the Ring. Careful analysis of troop deployments shows numerous instances where the forces of Mordor seemed poised for decisive advantage, only to be inexplicably delayed or diverted. Conversely, the defenders of Minas Tirith sometimes found routes unexpectedly clear when by all rights they should have been blocked by enemy forces. These coincidences accumulated beyond what chance could explain. The Witch King held back the full strength of Minas Morgul during critical periods. Gandalf appeared at seemingly impossible moments to turn the tide of battle. Both maintained the appearance of total opposition, while ensuring that neither gained a victory so complete it would destabilize the delicate balance holding the Nameless One at bay. Their cooperation extended to the matter of the One Ring itself. Both understood that its continued existence threatened the barriers between worlds, yet its destruction had to unfold in a specific manner to avoid creating the very breach they sought to prevent. This explains Gandalf's insistence on secrecy and stealth rather than direct confrontation, and the Witch King's curious lack of all-out pursuit once the ring had passed beyond Rivendell. The pinnacle of their unexpected alliance came during the Siege of Gondor. Historical accounts describe the Witch King as an unstoppable force, breaking the gates of the city and declaring that no living man could hinder him. Yet eyewitnesses also reported strange hesitations, moments when the Lord of the Nazgul seemed to deliberately hold back his full power. He entered the city but diverted his attention to Gandalf rather than pressing immediately to the citadel, a decision military strategists have long questioned. This confrontation on the streets of Minas Tirith, Gandalf upon Shadowfax facing the Witch King upon his fell beast, has been interpreted as a clash between ultimate good and evil. In truth, it was something far more complex, a carefully orchestrated exchange of power. The words spoken between them, recorded only fragmentarily by terrified observers, contained coded communications about the state of the barriers and the movements of the Nameless One's influence. "Old fool," the Witch King supposedly said. "This is my hour. Do you not know death when you see it? Die now and curse in vain." These words, while seemingly straightforward, contained a hidden message when interpreted through the ancient cipher they had discussed at Weathertop. The hour referred not to the fall of Gondor, but to the prophesied moment when the barriers would be tested most severely. Death, with its curious emphasis, pointed to the nature of the Nameless One as the ultimate unmaking. Curse in vain was a reference to specific wards that would need strengthening. Gandalf's reply, only partially recorded, included the phrase servant of Morgoth, which invoked not merely the first Dark Lord, but specific bindings placed upon the Nameless One during the creation of Arda. Their exchange, cloaked in the appearance of enmity, actually confirmed their continued cooperation against the greater threat. The arrival of the Rohirrim interrupted this exchange before its completion, forcing both Gandalf and the Witch King to resume their public roles as enemies. Yet enough had been communicated to ensure their continued alignment of purpose through the final stages of the war. The Witch King departed to face this new threat, knowing that his end approached and that it must come in the manner foretold for the barriers to hold. His final battle on the Pelennor fields unfolded according to the prophecy, with no man delivering the fatal blow, but rather a woman of Rohan and a hobbit of the Shire. This specific combination of a shield maiden who had renounced her expected role and a halfling from a race outside the accounting of the great powers created precisely the paradox needed to turn the Witch King's defeat into a strengthening of the barriers. As he diminished and passed from the circles of the world, the energy bound within his ring and within his very being was not released chaotically, but channeled according to patterns established during his meeting with Gandalf. His final words, heard only by Eowyn and unrecorded in any chronicle, were not a curse but a completion of the spell begun at Weathertop. This unexpected alliance between Gandalf and the Witch King, maintained in absolute secrecy and disguised as enmity, represents perhaps the most remarkable cooperation in the history of Middle-earth. Two beings created for opposite purposes, serving masters who stood in eternal opposition, nonetheless found common cause against a threat that transcended their ancient conflict. In doing so, they demonstrated a truth often forgotten in tales of good versus evil, that existence itself precedes moral alignment, and that sometimes preservation requires cooperation between the most unlikely allies. The impact of their alliance extended far beyond their personal actions. By coordinating their efforts while maintaining the appearance of opposition, they established a pattern that allowed the barriers against the Nameless One to be strengthened through the very conflict that threatened to weaken them. The War of the Ring, potentially catastrophic in its effects on the fabric of reality, instead became a reweaving of that fabric, a reinforcement of the walls between worlds precisely when they faced their greatest test. This hidden dimension of the war explains many of its supposedly miraculous turns, from Frodo's survival of the Morgul blade to the inexplicable confidence Gandalf maintained even in the darkest moments. It reveals the true nature of prophecy in Middle-earth, not as mere prediction, but as a guideline, a framework within which free will could operate to achieve necessary outcomes without sacrificing the moral autonomy that gave those outcomes meaning. The alliance between Gandalf and the Witch King was not friendship, not reconciliation, not redemption. It was necessity raised to the level of cosmic principle, the recognition that existence itself requires both light and shadow in balanced opposition. In their temporary alignment against the Nameless One, they embodied the fundamental pattern of Arda, not good triumphant over evil, but creation maintaining itself against the ever-present possibility of uncreation, the music continuing despite the discord woven through it. The secret meeting between Gandalf and the Witch King at Weathertop Cast ripples across the entirety of the War of the Ring, altering events in ways both subtle and profound. Like stones dropped into still water, their cooperation created patterns of influence that extended far beyond their direct actions, touching the lives of all who participated in the great conflict of the Third Age. The most immediate effect manifested in the behavior of the Nine, following their failure to capture Frodo at the ford of Bruinen. Historical accounts describe the Ringwraiths as temporarily defeated, their physical forms destroyed by the flood engineered by Elrond. What these accounts fail to explain is why, upon regaining physical form, the Nine did not immediately resume their hunt for the ring with the same intensity as before. The answer lies in the Witch King's subtle redirection of their efforts. As their lord, he maintained significant influence over the other 8 Nazgul, even while respecting Sauron's ultimate authority. Following Weathertop, he deliberately focused their attention on military preparations rather than the hunt for the ring, insisting that building Mordor's armies took precedence over pursuing a single hobbit who would eventually come to them. This strategy served multiple purposes. It maintained the appearance of dedication to Sauron's goals while giving the Fellowship crucial time to organize and depart Rivendell. It directed the Dark Lord's attention toward conventional warfare, where victory or defeat would not immediately trigger the conditions for the Nameless One's intrusion, and it allowed the Witch King to position his forces in ways that appeared aggressive but actually protected certain key locations where the barriers between worlds were thinnest. Gandalf, for his part, carefully managed the Fellowship's journey to exploit these subtle advantages. His insistence on the route through Moria, long questioned by scholars as unnecessarily dangerous, takes on new significance when understood as part of their shared strategy. The ancient dwarf realm represented one of the deepest wounds in the fabric of Middle-earth, a place where the dwarves had delved too greedily and disturbed things better left undisturbed. By passing through Moria and confronting the Balrog, Gandalf was able to establish new wards at this critical weak point. His death and subsequent transformation from Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White represented far more than personal apotheosis. The process of passing beyond the circles of the world and returning granted him unique insight into the nature of the barriers and the movements of the Nameless One beyond them. It also allowed him to shed certain limitations placed upon the Astari, giving him greater freedom to act directly against the growing threat. The timing of his return, coinciding exactly with the Witch King's departure from Minas Morgul to lead the assault on Gondor, suggests coordination beyond mere chance. Both beings had positioned themselves to enact complementary workings of power at the moment when the war entered its most critical phase. The division of the Fellowship, often attributed to the corrupting influence of the Ring, served a deeper strategic purpose. By separating into smaller groups traveling different paths, they established a network of influence that strengthened the barriers at multiple locations simultaneously. Aragorn's journey through the paths of the dead, Frodo and Sam's approach to Mordor through the pass of Cirith Ungol, and Gandalf's presence at Minas Tirith created a triangulation of power that stabilized the fabric of reality during its greatest stress. These movements corresponded precisely with the deployment of the Nine. The Witch King focused his attention on Gondor, drawing 7 of his fellow wraiths with him. The remaining Nazgul was assigned to guard Cirith Ungol, a position that placed it perfectly to monitor one of the thinnest points in the barriers. This distribution, while appearing to serve Sauron's military objectives, actually established a mirror counterpart to the Fellowship's own triangulation. Perhaps most significant were the effects on the One Ring itself. Both Gandalf and the Witch King understood that the ring represented the greatest potential breach in the barriers, a concentration of power specifically designed to dominate wills and reshape reality. Its destruction had to occur in a precise manner to avoid causing the very catastrophe they sought to prevent. This explains both Gandalf's refusal to take or use the ring and the curious lack of all-out pursuit once it had passed beyond Rivendell. The wizard knew that touching the ring would link him directly to it, creating a connection the Nameless One could potentially exploit. The Witch King, meanwhile, ensured that the pursuit remained threatening enough to keep the ring moving toward Mount Doom, but never so overwhelming that its bearer would be forced to use it in self-defense. Their hidden influence extended even to the seemingly random chances that repeatedly saved Frodo and Sam on their journey. The timely arrival of eagles, the momentary weakening of vigilance at crucial borders, the convenient positioning of allies exactly when needed. Most all these coincidences formed part of a pattern established during the meeting at Weathertop and maintained through subtle communications throughout the war. The confrontation at the Black Gate represents perhaps the clearest example of their cooperation. Gandalf's strategy of drawing Sauron's attention away from Mount Doom appears, on the surface, to be a desperate gamble. In reality, it was a carefully calculated move, timed precisely to coincide with events the Witch King had set in motion before his fall. The remaining 8 Nazgul, no longer under the direct control of their lord, should have been positioned to guard Mount Doom itself, the most obvious target for anyone seeking to destroy the ring. Instead, they were deployed elsewhere, leaving only ordinary guards who could be overcome by 2 exhausted hobbits. This inexplicable lapse in security can only be explained by the lingering influence of the Witch King's final commands, issued with the foreknowledge of how events must unfold. The moment of the ring's destruction marked the culmination of their shared strategy. As Orodruin erupted and the foundations of Barad-dûr crumbled, the energy released could have torn the barriers irreparably, creating exactly the opening the Nameless One sought. Instead, this power was channeled along pathways established by Gandalf and the Witch King, actually reinforcing the boundaries between worlds at their weakest points. This channeling manifested visibly as great cracks opening in the earth, swallowing Sauron's armies and structures. What appeared to be mere geological upheaval was in fact a deliberate restructuring of the physical realm to better anchor it against incursion from beyond. The destruction wrought upon Mordor, while devastating, actually prevented far greater devastation that would have extended beyond Middle-earth to the fabric of existence itself. The aftermath of the war revealed further evidence of their cooperation: the rapid healing of blighted lands, the unusually swift reconstruction of damaged cities, the renewed fertility of regions long barren. These were not merely signs of evil's defeat, but manifestations of strengthened barriers between worlds. The natural order, no longer strained by pressure from beyond, reasserted itself with remarkable vigor. Most tellingly, the dreams that had plagued sensitive individuals throughout Middle-earth, strange visions of an eye rimmed with stars, sensations of vast hunger beyond the walls of night, ceased entirely following the ring's destruction. The Nameless One's influence, while not eliminated, had been successfully contained for another age. The ripple effects of the Weathertop meeting thus extended to every aspect of the War of the Ring, transforming what appeared to be a straightforward conflict between good and evil into something far more complex. a carefully orchestrated rebalancing of cosmic forces, a reinforcement of reality's foundations at the moment of their greatest vulnerability. Neither Gandalf nor the Witch King lived to see the full manifestation of their work, Gandalf passing over the sea with the last of the Eldar, the Witch King falling on the fields of Pelennor, yet the pattern they established continued to shape Middle-earth long after their departure. This hidden dimension of the war remains unrecorded in official histories, unknown to all but the wisest of the wise. Yet its effects touch every tale of the Fourth Age, every song of renewal and rebuilding, every peaceful year granted to the free peoples after Sauron's fall. For in the secret meeting between sworn enemies, in their temporary alignment against a greater threat, lay the preservation not just of Middle-earth, but of existence itself, the continuation of the great music, despite the discord woven through it. The true legacy of Gandalf and the Witch King thus lies not in their visible opposition, chronicled in songs and stories throughout the ages, but in their hidden cooperation, remembered only in whispers among the highest circles of lore-masters. It is a legacy that challenges the simplistic view of good triumphant over evil, revealing instead a more profound truth, that creation requires both light and shadow in balanced harmony, and that sometimes the greatest victories come not through the defeat of one's enemies, but through the recognition of common cause with them, however briefly, against threats that transcend all mortal conflicts. The time has come to draw together all threads of evidence, to unveil the complete picture of what truly transpired between Gandalf and the Witch King at Weathertop, and why the consequences of their meeting reverberate through the history of Middle-earth even beyond the end of the Third Age. What follows is the forbidden truth, assembled from fragments scattered across ancient texts, hidden references, and the observable patterns of events that cannot be explained by conventional understanding of the War of the Ring. At the heart of this revelation lies a cosmic reality, seldom acknowledged in the chronicles of Middle-earth. The existence of the Nameless One, an entity older than Arda itself. Neither good nor evil, as mortals, understand these concepts, but rather the embodiment of uncreation, the void from which all things emerged, and to which all things might return. This entity existed before the music of the Ainur, was present as a silent potential during the creation of the world, and has remained beyond the walls of night ever since, separated from the created realm by barriers established at the foundation of existence. These barriers, while powerful, were not impregnable. They could be weakened by specific actions within Arda, particularly by concentrations of power that distorted the natural order. The rings of power, especially the One Ring, represented precisely such concentrations. Sauron, in his pride and ambition, had unknowingly created tools that served not only his desire for dominion, but also the Nameless One's potential entry into the created world. Both Gandalf and the Witch King, from their vastly different perspectives, had glimpsed this terrible truth. Gandalf, as a Maya who had existed before taking physical form in Middle-earth, carried fragmentary memories of the void and what dwelled there. The Witch King, through his transformation into a wraith existing simultaneously in the physical and spiritual realms, had developed sensitivity to disturbances in the fabric of reality. Both had independently come to the same conclusion. The War of the Ring threatened not just the freedom of Middle-earth's peoples, but the continued existence of Middle-earth itself. Their meeting at Weathertop was no chance encounter, but a deliberately arranged conference between representatives of opposing cosmic forces, temporary allies against a threat that transcended their ancient enmity. What passed between them that night was not merely information but a binding pact, sealed with powers beyond mortal comprehension, establishing a framework for cooperation that would remain hidden beneath their visible opposition. The first element of this pact concerned the 9 ring-wraiths. As extensions of Sauron's will, they served as conduits for his power throughout Middle-earth. But as beings caught between life and death, they also created natural weak points in the barriers between worlds. The Witch King, as their lord, possessed limited ability to modify their behavior and positioning. He agreed to deploy them in patterns that would minimize damage to the barriers, focusing their activities away from the thinnest points in the fabric of reality. Gandalf, in turn, committed to guiding the Fellowship along routes that would allow for the strengthening of these same weak points. His seemingly inexplicable insistence on certain paths, often questioned by his companions, served this hidden purpose. The journey through Moria, the visit to Lothlorien, the division of the company at Amon Hen, all these decisions positioned the bearers of hope exactly where they were needed to reinforce the barriers through their actions and mere presence. The second element concerned the One Ring itself. Both understood that its destruction was necessary, yet also potentially catastrophic if accomplished improperly. The concentrated power within the ring, if released suddenly and chaotically, might tear open the very barriers they sought to maintain. The Witch King provided crucial information about the ring's underlying structure, knowledge he had gained through his own binding to a lesser ring of the same design. Gandalf used this information to plan precisely how the ring should be unmade. This explains the wizard's insistence on secrecy and stealth, rather than direct confrontation. It clarifies why he rejected suggestions to use the ring against Sauron or to hide it away indefinitely. The ring had to be destroyed at a specific location, Mount Doom, in a specific manner, by the voluntary relinquishment of one who had claimed it. Any other approach risked creating the very breach the Nameless One awaited. The third and perhaps most significant element of their pact involved the Witch King's own fate. The prophecy that not by the hand of man shall he fall had long been interpreted as a protection, a limitation on who could defeat him. In truth, it was a prescription defining exactly how he must be defeated for his passing to strengthen rather than weaken the barriers. The Witch King knew he must fall. His continued existence as a wraith represented a persistent wound in the fabric of reality. But his destruction had to occur in a very specific manner, at a specific time and place, by specific hands. Only then would the energy bound within him be released in a pattern that reinforced rather than damaged the walls between worlds. This knowledge explains his seemingly erratic behavior during the War of the Ring, his hesitations and unexpected withdrawals, his focus on certain targets to the exclusion of more obvious ones. He was not merely pursuing Sauron's objectives, but carefully positioning himself for the prophesied encounter that would transform his defeat into the greatest victory against the Nameless One. Gandalf, understanding the necessity of this sacrifice, worked subtly to ensure the prophecy's fulfillment. His encouragement of Eowyn, his positioning of Merry within the forces of Rohan, his strategic advice to the captains of the West. These actions, while serving immediate military objectives, also served to guide the Witch King toward his necessary end. The full implementation of their pact unfolded throughout the War of the Ring, invisible to most participants, yet decisive in determining the ultimate outcome. The visible conflict between good and evil, between the free peoples and the forces of Mordor, provided cover for a deeper cooperation against a threat that would have consumed both sides equally. This cooperation manifested in several key moments that have long puzzled scholars of Middle-earth's history. The flood at the ford of Bruinen, attributed solely to Elrond's power, actually combined elven magic with dark enchantments established by the Witch King himself, creating a barrier specifically tuned to repel the Nameless One's influence rather than merely the physical forms of the ringwraiths. The journey through Moria, seemingly a desperate choice forced by adverse conditions, allowed Gandalf to confront and bind not just the Balrog but deeper, older entities stirring in the foundations of the mountains, entities that responded to the Nameless One's growing influence. The Battle of Pelennor Fields, presented in chronicles as a straightforward clash between the forces of Gondor and Mordor, incorporated elaborate magical workings embedded in the movements of troops, the timing of charges, even the positioning of fallen warriors. These patterns, visible only from above, strengthened the barriers directly beneath Minas Tirith, a city built atop one of the thinnest points in the fabric of reality. The confrontation at the Black Gate, apparently a diversionary tactic to draw Sauron's attention from Frodo and Sam, served the additional purpose of establishing a massive focusing pattern. The arrangement of forces, the timing of engagements, the very formation of the armies created a lens that would direct the energy released by the ring's destruction along safe channels, rather than allowing it to tear randomly through the barriers. Most significantly, the moment of the ring's destruction itself became not just the defeat of Sauron, but the resealing of ancient barriers, the reinforcement of the walls between worlds at precisely their weakest point. The cataclysmic eruption of Mount Doom, the collapse of Barad-dûr, the earth opening to swallow Sauron's armies. These were not merely the physical consequences of the ring's unmaking, but manifestations of cosmic rebalancing, the visible effects of barriers being renewed through the released energy. This forbidden truth transforms our understanding of the War of the Ring from a simple tale of good triumphant over evil to something far more profound, a moment when the very foundations of reality were at risk, when representatives of opposing forces recognized their common interest in existence itself and cooperated to ensure its continuation. It reveals Gandalf and the Witch King not merely as enemies, but as reluctant collaborators in the preservation of a world that required both light and shadow to maintain its integrity. The implications extend beyond the end of the Third Age, into the dawn of the Fourth. The departure of the Eldar, the fading of magic from Middle-earth, the gradual transition to the dominion of men, these changes, often attributed to the natural progression of ages, actually represented necessary adjustments to strengthen the barriers permanently. The concentration of power that had made Middle-earth vulnerable to the Nameless One was deliberately dispersed, spread thin enough that it could no longer serve as a potential breach point. This dispersion required sacrifices from all the free peoples. The elves relinquished their timeless realms and departed over the sea. The dwarves scaled back their delving into the deep places of the world. Men surrendered access to certain forms of power and knowledge, accepting limitations that would protect them from inadvertently weakening the barriers again. Even the hobbits returning to their peaceful shire carried forward subtle patterns of behavior and tradition that maintained a small but crucial portion of the overall warding. The most poignant sacrifice came from the ring-bearers themselves. Frodo's inability to reintegrate into the Shire, his continuing pain from wounds that should have healed, his eventual departure over the sea, these were not merely personal tragedies, but necessary consequences of his role in the cosmic rebalancing. Having carried the ring and stood at the center of the resealing, he had become permanently connected to the barriers themselves, a living anchor that both strengthened them and suffered from that connection. Gandalf's departure with the last of the Eldar similarly represented not merely the end of his mission in Middle-earth, but a final strengthening of the barriers. As a Meriaur, his very presence represented a concentration of power that, while beneficial during the crisis, could become problematic in the new equilibrium. His return to the West completed the pattern established at Weathertop, the final move in the great game played against the Nameless One. The Witch King, having fulfilled his part through his fall on the Pelennor fields, achieved something few would have thought possible, a measure of redemption. Not forgiveness for his centuries of evil, not erasure of the suffering he had caused, but purpose found even in darkness, significance discovered in necessary sacrifice. His passing released the energy bound in his ring not chaotically, but in precisely the pattern needed to strengthen the barriers at a critical moment. This forbidden truth challenges our conception of good and evil in Middle-earth, revealing a cosmic reality more complex than simple moral opposition. It suggests that the structure of existence itself requires both creative and destructive forces, both light and shadow in balanced interaction. The defeat of Sauron did not represent the eradication of darkness, but its realignment, its restoration to its proper role within the great pattern. The secret meeting between Gandalf and the Witch King at Weathertop thus stands revealed as one of the most significant events in the history of Middle-earth, though unrecorded in any official chronicle. In that brief alignment between sworn enemies, in their recognition of common cause against a threat beyond comprehension, lay the salvation not just of the free peoples, but of existence itself, the continuation of the great music, despite the discord woven through it. This is the forbidden truth, hidden for ages, whispered only among the highest circles of lore masters, preserved in fragments scattered across texts, separated by time and distance. It reveals the War of the Ring not merely as the end of the Third Age, but as the preservation of all ages, the moment when the pattern established at the foundation of Arda was renewed for another great cycle of the world. As the Fourth Age unfolds and the memory of earlier times fades into legend, this deeper understanding remains embedded in the very structure of Middle-earth, in the patterns of stars overhead, in the flow of rivers, in the songs sung by those who remember nothing of their origin. For the barriers stand renewed, the walls between worlds strengthened, the nameless one contained beyond the circles of the world, and though few remember how or why, all who dwell in Middle-earth continue to exist because of what transpired between light and shadow upon Weathertop, when enemies became allies against the greatest threat of all. The next time you hear the tale of the War of the Ring, remember this hidden dimension, this secret collaboration beneath the visible conflict. Look beyond the simple narrative of good triumphant over evil to perceive the more profound truth that existence itself precedes moral alignment, that preservation sometimes requires cooperation between the most unlikely allies, and that the greatest victories may come not through the defeat of one's enemies, but through the recognition of common cause with them against threats that transcend all mortal conflicts. This is the forbidden truth finally revealed, the secret meeting between Gandalf and the Witch King at Weathertop, and the cosmic consequences that flowed from their temporary alignment against the hunger beyond the walls of night.
Welcome to another journey through the forgotten tales of Middle-earth. If you enjoy these sleep stories, please remember to like and subscribe for more adventures in the realm of dreams. The ancient library of Rivendell lay silent save for the soft rustle of parchment. Lord Elrond stood motionless, his ageless eyes fixed upon a weathered document illuminated by a single candle. His hand trembled slightly as his fingers traced the faded script, an occurrence so rare that the attending scholar glanced up in alarm. What Elrond held was impossible, a fragment of history deliberately concealed, discovered purely by chance within the binding of an ancient tome of elvish lore. The document spoke of an encounter that had never been recorded in any official history of Middle-earth, a meeting so dangerous its very existence had been struck from record. A secret confrontation between Gandalf the Grey and the Dark Lord, Sauron himself, centuries before the War of the Ring. Wind rushed suddenly through the open windows, extinguishing half the candles in the chamber. Elrond looked up, his expression grave, as shadows danced across the walls. "Tell no one of this discovery," he commanded the scholar. "Some secrets were buried for good reason." But what reason could be great enough to conceal such a meeting? What truly transpired when the Grey Pilgrim faced the Lord of Darkness? And most troubling of all, what agreement might have been struck between light and shadow? The document revealed only fragments. A fortress in the Grey Mountains. A conversation beneath stone carved with forgotten runes. And most disturbing of all, the words reportedly spoken by Gandalf himself. "Then we are agreed. None shall know of this meeting, nor of what passes between us this night." Elrond carefully refolded the parchment, his mind racing through the implications. If this account were true, everything they believed about the conflict with Sauron might be built upon half-truths. The fate of Middle-earth had perhaps turned on this single secret meeting. What power could have compelled Gandalf to meet with the greatest evil of the age? What knowledge was exchanged in that hidden hour? And why had two immortal beings bound in eternal opposition chosen to keep their confrontation buried from the knowledge of all free peoples? The answer lay within the faded ink of a hidden history, waiting to be revealed. The grey mountains stood as ancient sentinels along the northern reaches of Middle-earth, their jagged peaks piercing the low-hanging clouds like the teeth of slumbering dragons. Far older than the kingdoms of men, or even the realms of the elves, these mountains had witnessed the shaping of the world and kept their secrets locked within stone depths untouched by mortal hands. Upon the eastern spur of these mountains, nearly forgotten by all save the most ancient of dwarven records, there stood a fortress unlike those built by the younger races. Its foundations had been laid in the First Age by hands that understood the deep magics that bound stone to will. Originally a watchtower during the wars of Beleriand, it had passed through many hands over the long ages, each occupant leaving their mark upon its weathered walls. The fortress bore no name in common tongue, for names have power, and this place had been deliberately obscured from memory. In the oldest dwarven records it was called Barazinbar Duban, the fortress of dark vigilance, though few now living would recognize such a title. Its halls were constructed of a strange, dark stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The corridors wound inward like the twisted passages of a fell dream, leading always downward toward chambers carved deep within the living rock of the mountain. The craftsmanship was neither dwarven nor elven, but something more primal that spoke of hands that had learned their craft when the world was young. The council chamber where Elrond now stood was bathed in the golden light of Rivendell, a stark contrast to the fortress described in the mysterious document. Around him gathered the few he had summoned to bear witness to this troubling discovery. Galadriel stood near the window, her ancient eyes reflecting the light of stars long extinguished. Of all those present, she alone might remember the construction of the fortress described, for her memory stretched back to the shores of Valinor before the rising of the sun. Arwen sat quietly beside her father, her gentle face troubled as she studied the fragments of parchment laid carefully upon the table. Though young by the reckoning of her people, her wisdom ran deep as mountain roots. The elven chronicler, who had discovered the hidden document, stood nervously at the edge of the chamber. Lindir was his name, a scholar devoted to preserving the histories of Middle-earth. His slender fingers still bore the dust of ancient bindings, and his eyes were wide with the enormity of his discovery. There is a presence there, a will that bends the very life of the forest to its purpose. But more than this, I cannot say, for when I drew too near, my thoughts became confused, and my purpose forgotten. Gandalf had pondered these words as he smoked his pipe beneath the stars, sending rings of smoke floating upward to mingle with the night air. A will powerful enough to confound one of the Istari was cause for grave concern. It was on the 7th night after this meeting that the message came. A raven with unusually bright eyes had landed beside his campfire, a small scroll bound to its leg with thread of silver. The bird had fixed Gandalf with an intelligent gaze before departing swiftly, refusing the offered bit of bread. The message was written in an elegant hand using the high elven tongue, but something in the formation of the letters troubled Gandalf, as if the writer had learned the script rather than been born to it. Knowledge of what troubles the greenwood awaits one who seeks wisdom. The fortress of the ancient watch in the eastern grey mountains stands open to the grey pilgrim. No signature marked the parchment, and no seal had closed it. Yet the knowledge that someone recognized him not merely as a wandering wizard, but specifically as the Grey Pilgrim was disquieting. That same night Gandalf had dreamed of a tower of black stone and of words spoken in a tongue that had not been uttered in Middle-earth since the defeat of Morgoth in the First Age. He had awakened with a sense of dread, yet also with certainty that he must answer this summons, though it reeked of trap and treachery. Before departing, he had journeyed to the Grey Havens to consult with Círdan the shipwright, eldest of the elves remaining in Middle-earth, and one of the few who knew Gandalf's true nature and purpose. This meeting bears all the hallmarks of deception, Círdan had warned, his ancient eyes grave, beneath brows white as sea foam. Yet I perceive you have already decided to accept this invitation. Knowledge is a weapon sharper than any blade, Gandalf had replied. If there is truth to be learned about the shadow growing in Greenwood, I must seize this opportunity, whatever risks it may entail. Then take this with you, Círdan had said, pressing into Gandalf's hand a small phial of crystal, within which gleamed the light of a star. It contains light from the two trees that once illuminated Valinor. In the deepest darkness, it will remind you of who you are and why you were sent to these shores. Now, weeks after receiving the mysterious message, Gandalf approached the foothills of the Grey Mountains. The paths grew steep and treacherous, winding through narrow passes where the wind howled like the spirits of those who had perished among these unforgiving peaks. On the third day of his ascent, he came upon a dwarf huddled in the shelter of an overhanging rock, his beard matted with blood from a wound upon his brow. "What brings a son of Durin so far from the halls of his people?" Gandalf asked, kneeling to offer water to the injured dwarf. "Greed," the dwarf replied bitterly. "We heard tales of Mithril in these peaks and journeyed from the Iron Hills, seek our fortune. But the mountain did not welcome us. Your companions?" "Dead or scattered," the dwarf said, his voice hollow with grief. "Something dwells in the high fortress, something that spoke to us with fair words of treasure, calling itself the Lord of Gifts, but its gifts were false and its promises poison." Gandalf felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "This fortress, where might I find it?" The dwarf's eyes widened with fear. "You seek it. Then you seek your doom, wizard. But if you must know, follow the path that winds eastward, around the great spur of rock shaped like a crown. There you will find what remains of the ancient watchtower of Barazinbar. But do not say I did not warn you of what awaits within its shadows." The fortress of Barazinbar rose before Gandalf like a dark memory given form in stone. Unlike the graceful towers of elves or the sturdy halls of dwarves, this structure seemed to defy the very mountain upon which it was built. Its walls were fashioned of black stone veined with some mineral that caught what little sunlight penetrated the perpetual mists, gleaming with a sickly iridescence. Gandalf paused at the foot of the worn steps leading to the main gate, his senses alert to dangers both seen and unseen. No guard stood watch upon the battlements, and no banner flew from the highest tower, yet the fortress did not feel abandoned. Rather, it seemed to wait with the patience of stone, as if time itself held little meaning to whatever presence dwelled within. "I come at the invitation of the one who names himself Lord of Gifts," Gandalf called out, his voice carrying clearly through the mountain air. For a long moment, only silence answered him. Then, with a grating sound that echoed among the peaks, The great gates swung slowly inward, revealing a cavernous entrance hall beyond. Gandalf tightened his grip upon his staff and stepped forward, crossing the threshold into a space that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Torches burned in wall sconces, their flames steadier than natural fire should be, casting pools of amber light that barely held back the oppressive darkness. The entrance hall stretched before him, larger than it had appeared from outside, its dimensions somehow wrong in a way that disoriented the senses. The ceiling soared upward into shadow, supported by columns carved in the likeness of ancient trees, their stone branches intertwining to form arches of surprising delicacy. At the far end of the hall stood a figure clad in robes of deep crimson, face obscured by the hood drawn low over its features. "The Grey Pilgrim honours my humble abode," the figure said, its voice melodious and pleasing to the ear. "You have journeyed far in answer to my invitation. I seek knowledge of the shadow that grows in greenwood," Gandalf replied, advancing slowly across the vast hall, every sense alert for deception. "If you possess such wisdom, I would hear it." The figure drew back its hood, revealing a face of such striking beauty that Gandalf nearly faltered in his step. Neither male nor female in appearance, but rather a perfect blending of both, the being before him had skin like polished ivory and eyes of such penetrating intelligence that they seemed to pierce through flesh to the very soul beneath. "I am called Anatar," the figure said with a slight bow. "Though I have been known by many names throughout the long ages of this world. Please be welcome within these walls. Refreshment awaits in the chamber beyond, and then we may speak of matters that concern us both." Gandalf followed his host through a series of corridors that seemed to bend and twist in ways that defied natural geometry. The deeper they ventured into the fortress, the more Gandalf became aware of subtle signs that this place had been recently occupied after long abandonment. Dust lay thick in corners, but was disturbed by the passage of many feet. Old tapestries had been rehung on walls, their ancient weave depicting scenes from the earliest days of Middle-earth, including images that troubled Gandalf deeply, for they showed the forging of great rings of power. They came at last to a chamber less imposing than the entrance hall, but more richly appointed. A table of dark wood stood at its centre, laid with platters of food and decanters of wine. The walls were lined with shelves bearing scrolls and books, many so ancient their bindings crumbled at the edges, but it was what hung upon the wall behind the table that drew Gandalf's immediate attention, a map of Middle-earth rendered with exquisite detail, showing not only the current kingdoms of men and elves and dwarves, but marked with symbols and annotations in a script so ancient that even Gandalf, with his vast knowledge, could decipher only portions. "You have an interest in cartography," Gandalf observed, taking the seat offered to him, but leaving the food and drink untouched. "I have an interest in all things," Anatar replied with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, "but particularly in the changing faces of kingdoms and the rise and fall of powers in this middle realm." As they spoke of seemingly harmless matters, Gandalf studied his host with growing unease. There was something familiar in the cadence of Anatar's speech, in the graceful movements of his hands as he gestured to emphasize a point. A memory stirred at the edges of Gandalf's consciousness, a recollection from another age entirely, but it remained frustratingly elusive. His gaze was drawn repeatedly to a pedestal in the corner of the chamber upon which rested a small object, covered by a cloth of black velvet. Something about it called to him, a resonance that vibrated along paths of power that few in Middle-earth could perceive. Anatar followed his gaze and smiled once more. "You have keen senses, Grey One. Few would notice what lies beneath that covering, for I have taken pains to mask its presence. With a graceful movement he rose and crossed to the pedestal, drawing away the cloth to reveal a stone no larger than a man's fist, perfectly round and of a deep blue hue that seemed to shimmer with internal light. Around its circumference ran lines of strange runes that pulsed with a gentle rhythm, like the beating of a distant heart. "Do you recognize it?" Anatar asked, watching Gandalf's face closely. Gandalf felt a chill run through him, for indeed he did recognize the artifact, though he had never before laid eyes upon it. A palantir, one of the 7 seeing stones crafted in Valinor by the Noldor elves and brought to Middle-earth by Elendil. Most were thought lost or captured, their locations unknown save to a very few. "A dangerous tool to possess," Gandalf said carefully, "and one that raises many questions about your identity, Lord of Gifts." "All tools are dangerous in the wrong hands," Anatar replied smoothly. "In the right ones, they are merely useful. This one has shown me much of what transpires in the dark places of Middle-earth, including the spreading shadow that concerns you so greatly." He gestured toward the stone. "Would you care to look? Perhaps it will show you what you seek to know about the darkness growing within Greenwood." Gandalf regarded the palantir with caution, born of ancient wisdom. Such artifacts were not to be used lightly, for they connected to others of their kind, and one never knew who might be watching from the other side of such a connection. "I think not," Gandalf replied. "There are other ways to share knowledge that do not carry such risks." Anatar's expression did not change, but something flickered in the depths of his eyes, a momentary gleam like distant lightning. "As you wish, though I wonder what the Grey Pilgrim fears to see within a simple stone." As the hours passed within the dark fortress, Gandalf and his mysterious host spoke of many things. Anatar proved to be a being of vast knowledge, discussing the histories of Middle-earth with the familiarity of one who had witnessed them firsthand, rather than merely studied ancient texts. The shadow in Greenwood comes from the fortress of Dol Guldur in the southern reaches of the forest, Anatar explained, tracing a slender finger across the map that hung upon the wall. An ancient power has taken residence there, drawing to, itself creatures of darkness and bending the very essence of the forest to its will. "What manner of power?" Gandalf asked, his eyes never leaving the face of his host, searching for any sign of deception. "One of the Nameless," Anatar replied. "A spirit of malice from the elder days who has found a way to manifest once more. In physical form, it gathers strength slowly but surely, building towards some purpose not yet revealed." The explanation aligned with what Gandalf had already suspected, and with what Radagast had reported. It seemed a reasonable conclusion, for many evil things had escaped the breaking of Thangorodrim at the end of the First Age, fleeing into the dark places of the world to nurse their hatred through long centuries. "And how came you by this knowledge?" Gandalf inquired, sipping from a cup of water he had drawn himself, rather than accepting the wine offered by his host. "I have sources among the Easterling tribes who dwell near the forest borders," Anatar said smoothly. "They speak of strange occurrences, of beasts acting against their nature, of travellers who enter the forest never to return. But more than this, I have used the palantir to observe the movements of this power." Gandalf considered the information carefully. It was plausible that an Easterling lord of considerable learning might have come into possession of a seeing stone during the tumultuous years following the fall of Númenor. Such a being, viewing the growing darkness through the palantir, might indeed draw conclusions similar to those Gandalf himself had reached. "If what you say is true," Gandalf said slowly, Then this matter concerns all the free peoples of Middle-earth. Such a shadow must be investigated more thoroughly before it grows beyond containment. Indeed, Anatar agreed, his perfect face grave with apparent concern. Yet I wonder if the White Council has the will to act decisively in this matter. Saruman seems reluctant to acknowledge the growing darkness. Gandalf felt a sharp stab of suspicion at the mention of the White Council and its head. Such knowledge was not widely known outside the highest circles of power in Middle-earth. That this Easterling lord, however learned, should speak so familiarly of their internal deliberations was troubling. You seem remarkably well informed about matters kept secret by design, Gandalf observed, his tone carefully neutral. Anatar smiled, a flash of perfect teeth in the gloom of the chamber. Information is a commodity like any other Grey Pilgrim. It flows to those who know its value and are willing to pay the price of acquisition. As if sensing Gandalf's growing wariness, Anatar rose and moved to a wall sconce, adjusting the torch to cast more light upon the chamber. But perhaps you would care to examine something that may shed further light upon our discussion. From within the folds of his crimson robe, he produced a small metal box, adorned with the same strange runes that circled the Palantir. With a soft word spoken in a language Gandalf had not heard in many centuries, Anatar opened the box to reveal a collection of small stone tablets, each no larger than a man's palm, carved with intricate symbols. These were found near Dol Guldur by my servants, Anatar explained. They appear to be communication devices of some kind, allowing the Nameless One to extend its influence beyond the confines of the fortress. Gandalf accepted one of the tablets, turning it carefully in his hands. The runes were indeed ancient, dating to the First Age or perhaps even earlier. They pulsed faintly with an inner light similar to that of the Palantir, though more subdued. With a start, he recognized them as a variant of the script used in Morgoth's fortress of Angband, though adapted for some new purpose. These are objects of significant power, Gandalf acknowledged, and they confirm that whatever dwells in Dol Guldur is no mere wraith or lesser spirit, but something of far greater malice and purpose. Anatar nodded in satisfaction. Then we are of one mind on this matter. The question becomes what action to take against this growing threat. For a moment, Gandalf allowed himself to believe that he had indeed found an unexpected ally in this strange Easterling lord. The evidence presented aligned with his own investigations, and the knowledge demonstrated by his host, while unusually extensive, could be explained by possession of the Palantir and connections among the Eastern peoples. I shall bring this information before the White Council, Gandalf decided. These tablets will provide tangible evidence of the threat, perhaps enough to spur Saruman to action at last. A wise course, Anatar agreed, collecting the tablets and returning them to their container, though I would caution against undue haste. The Nameless One has agents in many places, some perhaps closer to your council than you might suspect. As Anatar spoke these words, his gaze met Gandalf's directly, and for an instant something shifted in those perfect features, like a mask momentarily slipping to reveal glimpses of what lay beneath. It was gone so quickly that Gandalf might have believed he imagined it, save for the sudden chill that ran through him, a warning from instincts far older than his current form. You speak as one with intimate knowledge of our adversary, Gandalf said carefully, measuring each word, almost as if you have encountered this presence directly. Anatar's smile remained unchanged, but his eyes grew watchful. All who study the darkness must sometimes gaze into its depths, Grey Pilgrim. How else are we to understand what we oppose? Night fell upon the mountain fortress, though within its windowless inner chambers, darkness and light held little meaning. Anatar led Gandalf deeper into the ancient structure, down winding staircases that spiraled into the very heart of the mountain. Few have walked these passages since the fortress was abandoned at the close of the First Age, Anatar said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The dwarves avoided this place even in the height of their kingdom, believing it cursed. "And what do you believe?" Gandalf asked, noting how the walls here were carved with symbols far older than those commonly used by elves or men, reminiscent of markings he had seen only in the most ancient texts preserved in Valinor. "I believe that knowledge has no moral character," Anatar replied with a slight smile. "It is neither cursed nor blessed, merely waiting for those with wisdom to claim it." They emerged into a vast chamber that appeared to have been carved from a natural cavern. Unlike the upper levels of the fortress, which bore the marks of many different occupants throughout the ages, this space remained as it had been created in the dawn of Middle-earth. Great pillars rose to support a ceiling lost in shadow, each carved in the likeness of a tree with sprawling branches that intertwined overhead. At the center of the chamber stood a circular table of black stone, its surface polished to such perfection that it reflected the light of Anatar's torch, like the surface of a midnight pool. Around its edge were 7 high-backed chairs, each carved from a different material, stone and metal and wood from trees long extinct in Middle-earth. As they approached the table, a figure stepped from behind one of the massive pillars, causing Gandalf to tighten his grip upon his staff. "Peace, wizard," the figure said in the rough accent of the northern dwarves. "I mean no harm to you or my lord." The dwarf was broad-shouldered and stern-faced, his beard braided in the fashion of the Iron Hills, adorned with clasps of dull metal. His eyes, however, held a strange light, almost feverish in its intensity. "This is Khazad, my most loyal servant," Anatar explained. "He guides me through the mountains and ensures that my studies here remain undisturbed." Gandalf regarded the dwarf carefully. "We met one of your kinsmen on the path," he said, "wounded." "And speaking of betrayal..." Something flickered in the dwarf's expression, quickly masked. "Nori always was weak of heart and mind," he replied dismissively. "He fled when we discovered the true treasures this place holds, treasures beyond mere gold or jewels." Anatar gestured toward the table. "Speaking of treasures, I have something to show you that may shed light on our earlier discussion." The black stone surface lay a large parchment, yellowed with extreme age, yet perfectly preserved. Gandalf recognized it immediately as a map, though unlike any he had seen before. It depicted Middle-earth as it had existed in the Second Age, with 7 locations marked in red ink, connected by lines of gold that formed a complex pattern across the continent. "This map was created by the elven smiths of Eregion," Anatar said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It shows the intended locations for the 7 rings given to the dwarf lords." Gandalf carefully examined the map, without touching it. Around the borders were annotations in a cipher he had not encountered before, though elements of it seemed familiar, echoing both elven script and something darker, more angular. "A fascinating historical relic," Gandalf said neutrally, though his mind raced with the implications of such a document. The crafting of the Rings of Power was a closely guarded piece of lore, their original locations known to few indeed in the current age. "More than that," Anatar said, leaning closer, his perfect face illuminated by the torch held by the dwarf. "The annotations contain instructions for using the rings in concert, for amplifying their power through specific alignments, knowledge lost even to those who created them." "And where did you acquire such a rare artifact?" Gandalf asked, observing how the dwarf Khazad stared hungrily at the map, his eyes never leaving the marks that indicated where the dwarven rings had once been distributed. "It was sealed within one of the pillars of this very chamber," Anatas replied smoothly, "along with other documents relating to ring law. I believe this fortress served as a secret repository of knowledge during the War of the Last Alliance, a place where crucial information could be preserved should Sauron prove victorious." The casual mention of the Dark Lord's name hung in the air between them. Gandalf noted how Anatar spoke it without the customary hesitation most displayed when referring to the ancient enemy. "You have an uncommon interest in the rings," Gandalf observed, his tone conversational, despite the wariness growing within him. "All who seek power must understand the greatest works of power ever created in Middle-earth," Anatar replied. "The rings represent the pinnacle of craft, the perfect blending of physical material and metaphysical will. Even those who oppose their use must study their nature." Outside, the wind had risen, howling among the mountain peaks and finding its way even into this subterranean chamber, where it created an eerie music as it passed through hidden apertures in the stone. The sound seemed almost like voices chanting in some forgotten tongue, rising and falling in a rhythm that made Gandalf's thoughts grow strangely sluggish. He looked up at the vaulted ceiling, where the torchlight now revealed ancient murals, depicting the forging of great rings. The artistry was exquisite, showing robed figures labouring at forges while a tall, beautiful being directed their work, his hands guiding theirs as the rings took shape. The face of this figure was rendered with particular care, its beauty almost painful to behold. With a sudden chill, Gandalf realized the face in the mural bore a striking resemblance to Anatar himself. Snow began to fall outside, visible through a high shaft that admitted a column of pale moonlight into the chamber. The flakes drifted down like spectral messengers, illuminated briefly in the shaft of light before vanishing into the shadows below. Gandalf stepped away from the table, moving to examine one of the pillars more closely. Upon it were carved runes. That struck him with immediate recognition, for they were nearly identical to those he knew existed upon the One Ring itself, though he had never seen them directly, knowing of them only through ancient accounts. "These markings," he said carefully, "they appear to be in the black speech of Mordor." "A keen observation," Anatar acknowledged, coming to stand beside him. "This fortress predates the creation of that tongue, of course. What you see here are the proto-forms from which that language later developed, the original words of power from which Sauron derived his speech of domination." "You speak with remarkable familiarity of such dark matters," Gandalf noted, watching the dwarf Khazad from the corner of his eye, aware that the stout figure had moved to position himself between Gandalf and the chamber's entrance. "To understand light, one must study darkness," Anatar replied. "Is that not why you came here, Grey Pilgrim? To understand the shadow growing in Greenwood by confronting knowledge others fear to seek?" Gandalf did not immediately reply, his attention caught by something in the patterns of gold upon the map. The lines connecting the 7 marked locations, when viewed from a particular angle, formed a shape reminiscent of an eye, lidless and wreathed in flame. The hour grew late, though in the windowless depths of the mountain fortress, time had little meaning. Gandalf felt a growing disquiet, a sense that beneath the civil conversation and scholarly discussion, currents of power were moving with purpose towards some unseen destination. They had returned to the upper chamber, where food and wine still waited untouched upon the table. Anatar moved with fluid grace to stand before the great map upon the wall, his slender fingers tracing the contours of lands long changed by the passing of ages. "Tell me, Grey Pilgrim," he said without turning, "what does the White Council know of the rings that remain?" The question hung in the air between them, deceptively simple, yet laden with implication. Gandalf considered his response, carefully, aware that the conversation had reached a critical juncture. "The three remain with the elves, as was intended," he replied at last. "The 9 were taken by the Nazgul, who fell under Sauron's dominion. Of the 7 given to the dwarves, some were consumed by dragon fire, others reclaimed by Sauron before his fall." "And the 1?" Anatar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What does your council believe of the ruling ring?" "It was lost," Gandalf said simply. "Cast into the river Anduin when Isildur fell. Whether it remains there or has been carried to the sea, none can say with certainty." Anatar turned then, and his face had changed subtly. The beauty remained, but there was a sharpness to it now, like the edge of a perfectly crafted blade, and his eyes held a light that seemed to burn from within. "Lost," he repeated, the word carrying a weight of ages. "A curious word for such a thing. Lost suggests the possibility of being found again, does it not?" He moved to stand behind his chair, his hands resting lightly upon its carved back. "And if it were found, what then? What would the wise counsel in such a circumstance?" "Its destruction," Gandalf replied without hesitation. "The ring was created for one purpose alone, to dominate all others. It cannot be wielded for good, regardless of the initial intentions of the bearer." A smile curved Anatar's perfect lips, though it did not reach his eyes. Such certainty from one who has never held it. "I wonder, is this your wisdom speaking, or merely the instructions given to you before you were sent to these shores?" The words struck Gandalf like a physical blow, for they revealed knowledge that no being in Middle-earth should possess, save those few who knew the true nature of the Istari. "I do not take your meaning," Gandalf said carefully, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly upon his staff. "Come now," Anatar said, his voice rich with amusement. "Let us set aside pretense, at least between ourselves. You are no mere wandering wizard Gandalf the Grey. Or should I address you as Olorin, as you were known in Valinor, before the Valar clothed you in that aging, mortal form and sent you here as their emissary?" The chamber seemed suddenly colder, the shadows deeper. Gandalf remained outwardly calm, though his mind raced through the implications of this revelation. "You claim unusual knowledge for an Easterling lord," he observed, neither confirming nor denying the assertion. Anatar laughed then, a sound of genuine mirth that echoed from the stone walls. "Is that what you believed me to be? How charmingly modest of you to think I would present myself as something so commonplace." With a gesture that seemed almost casual, he raised his hand, and the torches around the chamber flared suddenly brighter, their light taking on a quality that was not entirely natural. In that enhanced illumination, Anatar seemed to grow taller, his presence filling the room with a tangible power that pressed against Gandalf's senses. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," he said, his voice deeper now, resonating with authority. "I am Anatar, Lord of Gifts, yes, but that name was merely one of convenience, adopted for a specific purpose in an earlier age. Before that, I was called Myron, the Admirable, lieutenant to Melkor himself during the first age of this world." He paused, watching Gandalf's face closely. "But you would know me by the name given to me by the elves after my master's defeat. Sauron, they called me, the Abhorred." The name seemed to hang in the air between them, charged with the power of truth finally spoken aloud. Gandalf remained, utterly still, his expression betraying nothing of the shock and calculation racing through his mind. "If what you claim is true," Gandalf said at last, his voice steady, "then you take a great risk in revealing yourself so openly to one of the Istari." "Risk?" Sauron echoed, seeming genuinely amused by the concept. "What risk do I take? You are alone here, far from any who might aid you. And while your power is not inconsiderable, Olorin, do you truly believe you could stand against me in my own stronghold?" He gestured toward the seeing stone that still rested upon its pedestal. "Through the Palantir, I have watched the movements of all 5 Istari since your arrival in Middle-earth. I know that Saruman seeks knowledge above all else, that Radagast has become enamored of beasts and birds to the exclusion of his true purpose. The blue wizards have vanished into the east, their influence scattered and diluted among the tribes there." "And what of me?" Gandalf asked, genuinely curious despite the danger of his position. "What have you observed of my purpose?" "You alone. Remain true to your mission," Sauron acknowledged, an odd note of respect in his voice. "You walk among the lesser races, offering guidance rather than domination, wisdom rather than mere knowledge. It is why I sought this meeting. Of all your order, you alone might understand what I offer." "And what is that?" "Partnership," Sauron said simply. "Not servitude, not dominion, but true collaboration between equals." He moved to the window, where snow continued to fall in the darkness outside. "The Valar have abandoned Middle-earth, Olorin. They sit in their distant paradise, while the races here struggle and fade. The elves diminish, the dwarves delve ever deeper into their mountains. Men grow shorter, lived, and more quarrelsome with each generation." He turned back to face Gandalf, his expression earnest. "It need not be so. With the combined wisdom of our 2 orders, we could create something lasting here. A realm of order and beauty that does not depend upon the distant oversight of powers who refuse to intervene directly in this world they claim to cherish." "At what cost?" Gandalf asked quietly. "For there is always a cost to such ambitions," Sauron smiled. And for a moment Gandalf could see clearly what he must have been before his fall, a being of extraordinary brilliance and vision. The cost of all great works, Olorin. Sacrifice, discipline, the setting aside of smaller concerns for greater purpose. "And the ring?" Gandalf pressed. "Would this partnership include its recovery?" "The ring is a tool, nothing more," Sauron replied with a dismissive gesture. "One of many that might serve our greater purpose." But Gandalf had seen the flash in those ancient eyes at the mention of the ring, the momentary tightening of Sauron's perfect features that betrayed the lie. In his casual words, the One Ring was no mere tool to its creator, but the very center of his being, the focus of his will and power. "You offer much," Gandalf said carefully. "Such decisions cannot be made in haste." Dawn approached unseen beyond the mountain walls, but Gandalf sensed the changing hour as only one of the Maiar could. He had remained vigilant through the night, standing before one who had once been his kin in Valinor, before ambition and Melkor's influence had corrupted Sauron's path. They stood on a balcony carved into the eastern face of the mountain, overlooking the vast expanse of Rovaniel. The first light of morning touched the distant horizon, painting the snow-covered peaks in rose and gold. "Beautiful, is it not?" Sauron observed. "This world has a fragile splendor that Valinor, for all its perfection, could never match." "And yet you would reshape it to your design," Gandalf replied. eyes fixed on the awakening landscape, bending all things to your will rather than allowing them to follow their own nature. "Is that not what all thinking beings do?" Sauron asked, his voice reasonable, almost gentle. "The elves reshape forests to create their realms. The dwarves carve mountains into halls. Men build cities where once wild meadows grew. All exert their will upon the world. There is a difference between dwelling within the world and seeking to dominate it," Gandalf countered. "Between shaping one's surroundings and demanding that all conform to a single vision." Sauron smiled. "Philosophy was ever your strength." "Olorin, even in Valinor, you were known for wisdom rather than power." He gestured toward the horizon. "But wisdom without power to implement it is merely contemplation, ultimately futile in a world of action." Gandalf considered his words carefully. Though he stood before one of Middle-earth's greatest threats, this conversation represented a unique opportunity to understand his adversary's mind. "I have observed that power without wisdom invariably leads to destruction," he said at last. "Not only of others, but eventually of the wielder as well. Was that not the fate of your former master?" A shadow passed across Sauron's perfect features. Morgoth made errors of judgment. He became obsessed with destruction for its own sake, forgetting that true power lies in creation, in bringing order to chaos. "And you believe you have learned from his mistakes?" "I have had ages to contemplate them," Sauron replied. "While bound to my master, I could not fully pursue my own vision. After his defeat, I saw more clearly the path forward." He turned to face Gandalf directly. "You speak of dominion as if it were inherently evil, yet is that not precisely what the Valar exercise over Arda? They shaped the world according to their design, intervening when events displeased them, withdrawing when the consequences proved difficult." Gandalf recognized the dangerous seduction in these words, the half-truths woven with genuine insight that had led so many to follow Sauron through the ages. Even now, knowing fully whom he faced, Gandalf could perceive remnants of what this being had once been, a spirit of order whose gifts might have benefited all creation had they not turned to darker purpose. The Valar sought to implement Ilúvatar's vision, not impose their own designs in defiance of his, Gandalf said. There lies the fundamental difference, one that cannot be reconciled through wordplay or philosophy. Sauron's expression hardened. And yet Ilúvatar remains silent, offering no guidance as his creation suffers. Is blind obedience to an absent creator truly the highest wisdom you can offer, Olorin? The dwarf Khazad appeared at the entrance, bowing deeply. "My lord, the preparations you requested are complete." "Excellent," Sauron replied, dismissing him with a gesture before turning back to Gandalf. "I have had a chamber prepared for you. While our discussion continues, you should take some rest." Gandalf inclined his head slightly. "Before I consider rest, there is a matter I would have clarified. Throughout our conversation you have spoken of partnership, of shared purpose, yet you have not addressed the fundamental question that divides us." "And what is that?" Sauron asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "The freedom of the peoples of Middle-earth to determine their own fates," Gandalf said simply. "Any vision of order that denies this principle cannot be reconciled with the purpose for which I was sent to these shores." Sauron regarded him thoughtfully. "Freedom is a complex concept, Olorin. Consider the child who demands freedom to play with fire, unaware of the danger. Is it kindness to grant such freedom, or cruelty? The peoples of Middle-earth are not children Gandalf countered. "Are they not? They live such brief spans, accumulating little wisdom before passing. They make the same errors generation after generation, learning nothing from history. They war amongst themselves over trivial boundaries and imagined slights." Sauron moved to a small table where an ancient text lay open. "There is a prophecy, here, written before the breaking of Thangorodrim. It speaks of a time when the scattered kingdoms of men will be reunited under the banner of a returning king." Gandalf felt a chill at these words, for he knew of such prophecies, guarded closely by elven lawmasters and Númenórean descendants. "The line of Isildur continues unbroken," Sauron continued, watching Gandalf closely. "Though diminished and hidden, it endures. The heir of Elendil lives, though he knows not yet his destiny." "Your point?" Gandalf asked, his tone neutral, despite the significance of this revelation. "The prophecy speaks of restoration, of unification under a rightful lord. It is a vision of order imposed upon the fractious races of Middle-earth." His perfect lips curved in a slight smile. "Is that so different from what I propose?" "The methods may differ, but the outcome bears striking similarities." "The difference lies in choice," Gandalf said firmly. "In consent, freely given rather, than submission extracted through fear or deception. No matter how similar the outward forms, this distinction remains absolute." Sauron studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly as if acknowledging a well-made point. "You have given me much to consider, Olorin. Perhaps you will extend the same courtesy to my arguments during your rest." As Gandalf followed Khazad, from the chamber he felt Sauron's gaze upon his back, calculating and patient. The confrontation had barely begun, and already it had taken paths Gandalf could not have anticipated, a web into which he had willingly walked in search of truth. The chamber to which Khazad led Gandalf was smaller than those they had occupied previously, but appointed with surprising comfort. A fire burned in a hearth carved from the living rock, casting warm light across a bed, and chairs crafted in the elven style of the Second Age. Books and scrolls lined shelves along one wall, their spines bearing titles in languages both familiar and obscure. "My Lord Anatar suggests you might wish to refresh yourself," the dwarf said, gesturing to a basin of steaming water. "He will summon you when he is prepared to continue your discussion." When Khazad had departed, Gandalf moved carefully around the chamber, examining his surroundings with all his senses. The room contained no obvious traps or enchantments, though the entire fortress thrummed with ancient power that made subtle observations difficult. Gandalf did not touch the water or the food that had been provided, nor did he sit upon the bed. Instead, he seated himself cross-legged upon the stone floor, drawing his grey cloak around him, and withdrew his pipe from a pocket hidden within his robes. The familiar ritual of filling the pipe with leaf from the Shire brought comfort and clarity. As Gandalf kindled the leaf with a thought and a subtle gesture, he drew the smoke deep into lungs that, while appearing mortal, housed a spirit far older than the fortress around him. He exhaled slowly, the smoke forming a fine mist that spread throughout the chamber, seeming to cling to the corners and crevices where shadow lay deepest. Through this subtle working, he confirmed what he had already suspected. The chamber, like much of the fortress, was woven through with enchantments of observation. Sauron could perceive all that transpired within these walls, though the smoke now provided a measure of obscuration, a thin veil between Gandalf's thoughts and his host's perception. Secure in this minor protection, Gandalf considered all he had learned. Sauron's revelation of his true identity had been calculated, Of that Gandalf had no doubt. The Dark Lord could have maintained his disguise longer had he wished. That he had chosen to reveal himself suggested confidence, but also a desire for something that could only be obtained through honesty, understanding perhaps, or validation. For all his power and ancient knowledge, Sauron had been alone in his great purpose for ages beyond counting. Even his most devoted servants knew him only as lord and master, never as equal or confidant. In Gandalf he had recognized one of his own kind, a fellow Maya who might comprehend the scope of his ambitions without the limitations of mortal understanding. This realization brought no comfort to Gandalf. That one so fallen might still hunger, for connection made him more dangerous, not less. It suggested depths that simple evil did not possess, complexities that could not be dismissed with convenient labels of darkness or light. The smoke from Gandalf's pipe now filled the chamber with a fine haze, creating patterns that shifted and flowed. Within these patterns, Gandalf began to perceive something unexpected, faint images that seemed to arise from the stone itself, memories preserved in the ancient rock. He saw the fortress as it had been in the First Age, a watchtower, manned by elves of a lineage now extinct in Middle-earth. He witnessed its abandonment during the War of Wrath, when Morgoth was finally defeated. He observed its long emptiness, disturbed occasionally by wanderers who never remained long, sensing perhaps the lingering power that dwelt within the stone. And then, most recently, he saw Sauron's arrival, not in the fair form of Anatar, but in a shape of shadow and flame, weakened still from his defeat at the hands of the last alliance. The Dark Lord had come here to recover his strength, to rebuild his power in secret, while the Free Peoples believed him vanquished forever. The vision faded as the smoke began to dissipate. Gandalf replenished it with another long draw on his pipe, considering the implications of what he had glimpsed. Sauron had revealed his identity, yes, but not the full extent of his vulnerability. His power, while considerable, was not yet restored to its former heights. This meeting was taking place during a period of rebuilding, of preparation for the next phase of his eternal campaign. A soft knock at the door interrupted Gandalf's contemplation. The dwarf Khazad entered without waiting for a response, his expression carefully neutral as he regarded the wizard seated upon the floor amid swirling smoke. "My lord requests your presence once more," he said stiffly. Gandalf rose unhurriedly, tapping his pipe against his palm to extinguish the embers before returning it to his robes. "Lead on, Master Dwarf," he said mildly. Khazad led him not back to the balcony chamber, but deeper into the mountain, down winding stairs that descended far below the level of the entrance hall. The air grew warmer as they descended, until at last they emerged into a vast cavern where the heart of the mountain revealed itself. A chasm split the cavern floor, and from its depths rose heat and a ruddy glow that spoke of molten stone flowing far below. Spanning the chasm was a bridge of black metal, wrought in patterns that made the eye uneasy to follow. On the far side stood a forge unlike any Gandalf had seen since the fall of Eregion, where Celebrimbor had crafted works of wonder before Sauron's deception had been revealed. Sauron awaited them there, no longer wearing the fair form of Anatar, but something closer to his true nature. Taller now, his body wreathed in shadow that the forge light could not fully penetrate, his eyes gleaming within a fire. "Now we come to the heart of matters," Sauron said, his voice deeper than before, resonating through the cavern. "I have shown you my true self, Olorin. I have revealed my knowledge of the coming king, of the prophecies that bind our fates together, Now I shall show you what I propose for the future of Middle-earth. He gestured to the forge where metal glowed white-hot. Not domination through fear as Morgoth sought. Not rings to bind the will of others to mine. But a new ordering of the world, with each race contributing its unique gifts to a greater whole. Under your guidance, Gandalf observed. Under wise governance, Sauron corrected, which could include you and others of your order who share our vision. In that moment, Gandalf understood the second piece of the mystery that had brought him to this mountain fortress. The map he had seen was not merely a historical relic, but a working plan, one that revealed Sauron's current operations throughout Middle-earth. The chamber transformed around them. What had appeared as a simple forge suddenly revealed its true nature as the illusions crafted by Sauron fell away. The space was vast, extending deep into the mountain, filled with ranks of armor standing silent like an army, awaiting the command to march. Weapons of ancient design hung upon the walls, forged with skills long forgotten in the world above. 4 silent figures emerged from alcoves around the chamber, warriors clad in ornate armor of Eastern design, their faces impassive beneath half-helms of blackened steel. They positioned themselves at the corners of the forge platform, watching Gandalf with unblinking eyes. "My honor guard," Sauron explained, noting Gandalf's appraisal of the warriors. "Faithful servants from the eastern lands who understand the necessity of order." Gandalf said nothing, but his grip tightened almost imperceptibly upon his staff. The casual revelation of these hidden guardians, present yet concealed throughout their earlier conversations, spoke volumes about Sauron's confidence and the extent of his recovered powers. "You have been forthright with me, Olorin," Sauron continued, his form growing more distinct, more present, as if he were gradually allowing himself to fully materialize in the physical world. "You have not disguised your skepticism, nor hidden behind false courtesy. I respect that, even as I work to overcome your objections." He moved to a large table of black stone positioned near the forge. Upon it lay objects covered with cloths of dark velvet. With a graceful gesture, Sauron removed the first covering, revealing a model of a massive fortress constructed of some dark metal. "Barad-dûr," he said simply, "as it shall be rebuilt in Mordor, not merely a stronghold but a center of governance and learning. The foundations already lie beneath the ash of that land, awaiting only the final elements needed for its completion." He removed the second cloth, unveiling a perfect replica of the One Ring, gleaming in the forged light. "The key to all," Sauron said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Not merely a tool of domination, as you believe, but a focus for the reorganization of Middle-earth itself. Through it I can restore lands long blighted, bring fertility to deserts, establish a peace that spans from the western sea to the farthest reaches of Rhûn." "At the cost of freedom," Gandalf said quietly. "At the cost of chaos," Sauron countered. "I offer direction to races that have wandered purposeless since the departure of the Valar from direct intervention in their affairs." The form of Sauron shifted subtly as he spoke, becoming both more beautiful and more terrible to behold. No longer the perfect but limited shape of Anatar, nor yet the terrible Dark Lord of legend, but something between them, a being of immense power and presence that filled the vast chamber with his will. "I know you, Olorin," Sauron said, his voice resonating with a new intensity. "I have watched you since you came to these shores. Of all the Istari, you alone have remained true to your purpose, though you may not fully understand what that purpose is." He moved closer, his presence pressing against Gandalf's senses like a physical force. You were not sent merely to oppose me. That task could have been accomplished far more directly had the Valar wished it. No, you were sent to guide, to advise, to help the peoples of Middle-earth find their path. A path of their own choosing, Gandalf insisted, not one imposed upon them, no matter how benevolent the intention.
And if their choices lead them to destruction, Sauron asked, if their petty conflicts and short-sighted desires result in the ruin of all that is fair in Middle-earth, would you stand aside and watch them fall because you valued their freedom to choose error above their well-being?
The question struck at the heart of Gandalf's own doubt, concerns he had carried through long centuries of watching the follies of men and elves and dwarves, seeing wisdom ignored and ancient knowledge forgotten. How often had he been tempted to do more than advise, to take direct action, to prevent disaster? There is a middle path between domination and abandonment, Gandalf replied at last. Guidance that respects the dignity of free will while offering wisdom to those who would hear it. A path of half measures, Sauron said dismissively, of compromises that satisfy neither need. The time for such approaches is past, Olorin. The shadow in Greenwood is but the first sign of greater threats to come. Without unified purpose, the free peoples will fall one by one. He gestured, and the air between them shimmered, forming images of possible futures. Gandalf saw armies of orcs overrunning the lands of men, dragons returning from the northern wastes, ancient evils awakening from long slumber beneath mountain and forest. These threats approach whether we wish it or not, Sauron continued. The choice is not between freedom and control, but between purposeful unity and chaotic destruction. The visions shifted, showing instead great cities of stone and crystal, orderly fields producing abundant harvests, roads connecting realms once isolated from one another, knowledge flowing freely between races long suspicious of one another. This is what I offer, Sauron said softly. Not domination for its own sake, but order with purpose. A Middle-earth where the achievements of the First Age can be reclaimed and surpassed. Under your rule, Gandalf observed. Under my guidance. Initially, Sauron corrected, but with others of wisdom sharing in governance. The Astari were sent to these shores for a reason, Olorin. Perhaps this is that reason, though the Valar themselves may not have understood the true purpose of their actions. The visions faded, leaving only the reality of the chamber with its silent guardians and ancient weapons. Sauron regarded Gandalf with eyes that held the light of stars mingled with shadow. You need not answer immediately, he said, but consider what I have shown. Consider what might be accomplished if we set aside ancient enmities and recognized our common purpose. And if I refuse? Gandalf asked, his voice steady despite the weight of will directed against him. Then you depart as you came, Sauroni replied simply. I did not bring you here by force, nor will I keep you by such means. The choice must be yours, freely made, or it has no value. This unexpected response gave Gandalf pause. He had anticipated threats, perhaps even an attempt to overwhelm his will or bind him through some ancient sorcery. That Sauron would respect. His choice, even if that choice was rejection, suggested complexities to the Dark Lord's character that legend had long forgotten. You surprise me, Gandalf admitted. Because you know me only through the accounts of my enemies, Sauron said, with the faintest smile.
Even the wise see what they expect to see, Olorin. It is the greatest blindness of all. As he spoke these words, Sauron made a subtle gesture with one hand. The forge fire flared suddenly brighter, casting his shadow across the stone floor.
A shadow, that took a shape far different from the form that cast it. For an instant, Gandalf beheld the truth behind the fair appearance, the reality of what Sauron had become during his long rebellion against the natural order of Arda. In that moment of revelation, all pretense fell away between them. No longer was this a meeting between potential allies or even philosophical opponents. This was the confrontation that had been inevitable since Gandalf had first set foot upon the shores of Middle-earth, the meeting of powers ancient and terrible in their potential. "I know you now," Gandalf said quietly, "as you have always been."
"Not as you wish to appear." A silence fell between them, heavy as the mountain above. Sauron stood fully manifested, neither the fair Anatar, nor yet the Dark Lord of legend, but something between, a being of power barely contained within physical
form. "Yes," Sauron acknowledged, his voice resonating through the chamber. "You see me as I am."
"And I see you, Olorin, not as the wandering wizard in grey, but as the spirit of wisdom who once walked in the gardens of Lorien in Valinor." The Eastern warriors shifted positions, moving to encircle them. Steel whispered against leather as
weapons were drawn. "Your guardians grow anxious," Gandalf observed. "They sense the power you contain," Sauron replied. "Even constrained by the limitations the Valar placed upon you, your true nature cannot be entirely concealed." A new figure emerged from behind the forge, an elf clad in dark green who positioned himself near the chamber entrance, observing with keen eyes. "You did not mention your elven spy," Gandalf noted. "There are many in Middle-earth who recognize the necessity of what I propose," Sauron said smoothly. "Not all who serve me do so in darkness." "I did not come here to be recruited," Gandalf said. "Nor did you invite me with any real expectation that I would join you." "You underestimate my optimism," Sauron smiled. "Even the most steadfast purposes can be swayed when presented with new understanding." "Then why this meeting?" Gandalf pressed. "Why reveal yourself to one you must know would oppose your designs?" "To take your measure," Sauron replied simply. "As you have taken mine, we are opponents in a game that spans ages. It seems only proper that we should know one another directly, rather than through rumor and legend." He moved to the edge of the forge platform. "I wished to know if the Valar had sent you specifically to counter my return, if they had given you knowledge or powers beyond those granted to the other Istari." "And your conclusion?" "That they have not," Sauron said. "They sent 5 of you, scattered across Middle-earth with only vague guidance. They might have sent an army, or intervened directly as they did against Morgoth. Instead, they chose subtle influence through emissaries limited in their power." He shook his head slightly. "The Valar have withdrawn from direct involvement in the affairs of Middle-earth. They observe, but they will not act decisively, even against a threat they once deemed worthy of their full attention." "Perhaps they understand what you do not," Gandalf suggested. "That Middle-earth belongs to its peoples now, not to powers from beyond the sea. Our role is to guide, not to impose our will, no matter how benevolent we believe that will to be." "A convenient philosophy for those whose power has been constrained," Sauron replied. The dwarf Khazad burst into the chamber. "My lord, riders approach from the north, elves moving toward the fortress." "It seems our time grows short," Sauron said. "Your presence has been noted more quickly than I anticipated." "The White Council has many eyes," Gandalf replied. "Did you truly believe my journey here would go unremarked?" Unless this interruption was by design, Sauron's gaze sharpened. A signal, perhaps, arranged before you entered my domain? Gandalf smiled slightly. As you said, we are opponents in an ancient game. It would be unwise to enter your stronghold without certain precautions. For a moment, Sauron's composure slipped, revealing the terrible power beneath. The warriors drew their blades, blocking all exits. I could keep you here, Sauron said softly. The elves would find only an empty
fortress. You could try, Gandalf acknowledged, his staff beginning to glow.
But that was never your intention, was it? You sought understanding, not confrontation. Not yet. The moment stretched between them. Then Sauron laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. Well reasoned, he said. The time for our true confrontation has not yet come. We both have preparations to make, pieces to position upon the board. The warriors sheathed their weapons. You may go freely. Tell your council what you have learned, or keep it secret. Either serves my purpose. And what purpose is that? Gandalf asked. To ensure that when we next meet, all illusions have been set aside, Sauron replied. No more disguises. Only the truth of what we are and what we intend for Middle-earth. Khazad moved to guide Gandalf from the fortress. But as they turned to leave, Sauron spoke once more. One last thing, he said. The heir of Isildur, the one destined to reunite the kingdoms of men. I have already set forces in motion to find him. For what purpose? Gandalf asked. What better way to prevent the return of the king than to ensure no king remains to return? Sauron replied calmly. The line of Isildur will end, and with it any hope of restoration for the kingdoms of men. Then we are indeed opponents, Gandalf said quietly. And this meeting has served its purpose. As Khazad led him away, Gandalf saw the elven spy slipping through a different passage. In that moment, he made his decision. This knowledge would not be shared fully with the White Council, not even with Saruman. Some truths were too dangerous. The confrontation with Sauron would come, but not yet. Until then, Gandalf would watch and wait and prepare for the struggle that would determine the fate of Middle-earth. Evening light filled the council chamber in Rivendell, where Elrond stood before the gathered witnesses. The tale had been told, in full, pieced together from the fragments of the hidden manuscript and from Elrond's own knowledge. So Gandalf departed from the fortress, Elrond said. The elven riders were led by Glorfindel, who had grown concerned when Gandalf did not return from the northern mountains at the appointed time. They found him already descending the mountain paths, showing no outward sign of the momentous meeting that had transpired. And he told no one of this encounter? Arwen asked, her face troubled in the fading light. He confided only in Círdan upon his return to the Grey Havens, Elrond replied. And later, in me, though he shared not all the details we have now, learned from this manuscript. The dwarf Khazad, Galadriel said softly. What became of him? He did not survive the day, Elrond answered. Whether Sauron eliminated him to preserve the secret, or whether he attempted to follow Gandalf and met with some accident, none can say. His kinsmen searched for him through that summer, but found no trace. The council chamber fell silent, as each considered what they had learned. Outside, the waters of Rivendell flowed endless and pure. We must consider what this means for the struggle before us, Elrond said. Sauron knew of the heir of Isildur centuries ago. He has had long years to search for the remnants of that bloodline. Yet he has not found them, Arwen observed. The Northern Kingdom has kept its secrets well. And must continue to do so, Galadriel added, until the time is right for the heir to claim his birthright. Elrond gathered the fragments of the manuscript and returned them to their protective covering. This account must remain hidden, he decided. Knowledge of this meeting would serve only to create fear. Let it be sealed away where only the wise may access it if need arises. As Lindir took the wrapped manuscript, Elrond turned to the others. What we have learned may seem troubling, but I find hope within it. Sauron, for all his power, did not turn Gandalf from his purpose. He sought to recruit one of the Istari to his cause and failed. And in revealing his plans, Arwen added, he gave Gandalf the knowledge needed to counter them. Indeed, Elrond agreed. Though neither could have known it then, that meeting set in motion events that would eventually lead to the finding of the One Ring and perhaps to Sauron's final defeat. Night settled over Rivendell. Stars appeared one by one, the same stars that had shone upon Middle-earth through all its long history of struggle between light and shadow. "Let us take our rest," Elrond said at last. "Tomorrow brings its own concerns." As the council dispersed, Galadriel remained by the window, her ancient eyes reflecting the starlight. "The game continues," she murmured. "Pieces move upon the board that was set in motion ages ago." The night deepened over Rivendell, peaceful and serene. Within its protected valleys, knowledge both ancient and terrible had been understood and carefully set aside until such time as it might be needed. The streams continued their eternal flow, stars wheeled overhead, and Middle-earth slept, unaware of the currents of power that moved beneath the surface, preparing for the final confrontation. That would determine the fate of all.